Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. The early October morning arrived with a crisp chill that signaled the heart of autumn in rural Vermont. Harold Wilson pulled his worn flannel jacket tighter around his lanky frame as he stepped onto the back porch of his farmhouse, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his weathered hands. At 68, his once dark hair had faded to silver, but his blue eyes remained sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the rolling hills that surrounded his modest 10-acre property. The morning fog clung to the ground, weaving between the neat rows of apple trees that had become his passion in retirement. 5 years had passed since Harold had left his classroom at Burlington High School, where he'd taught American history for nearly 4 decades. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 2 years before his retirement, her battle with cancer leaving him alone in the house they had purchased 30 years ago, with dreams of someday turning it into their retirement haven. Without Margaret, Harold had thrown himself into transforming the neglected orchard on their property, finding solace in the rhythm of the seasons and the simple satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful. He set his coffee down on the porch railing and reached for his pruning tools hanging on the wall beside the door. Today was pruning day for the northeast corner of the orchard, where his prized Honeycrisp apples were just reaching their peak ripeness. These would fetch the best price at the weekend farmers market in Middlebury, where Harold had established himself as a reliable vendor with exceptionally sweet fruit. It wasn't about the money. His teacher's pension and Margaret's life insurance provided enough for his modest needs, but rather the connection to the community and the structure it gave to his weeks. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called a voice from the gravel driveway. Harold looked up to see Ethan Parker, his 20-something neighbor from the farm half a mile down the road, leaning out the window of his mud-splattered pickup truck. "Morning, Ethan," Harold replied, lifting his hand in greeting. "Headed into town?" "Yes, sir. Need anything while I'm there?" Harold considered for a moment. "No, thank you. I'm all set for now. Planning to head in myself tomorrow for the market." "Those Honeycrisps ready?" Ethan asked, his eyes drifting toward the orchard. "Just about perfect," Harold confirmed with a touch of pride. "Should have a good haul for tomorrow." "Save me a bag," Ethan said with a grin. "Sarah's been talking about making a pie." "Will do," Harold promised. Ethan and Sarah had been good neighbors since they'd purchased the old Jenkins place 3 years ago, starting their own small organic vegetable operation. The young couple had been a godsend to Harold, helping with heavier tasks around his property and checking in on him regularly without making him feel like an invalid. In return, Harold shared his knowledge of the area's growing conditions and the bounty of his orchard. As Ethan's truck disappeared down the long driveway, Harold gathered his tools and headed toward the orchard. The sun was beginning to burn through the morning fog, promising a beautiful fall day. He walked methodically down the rows of trees, his boots leaving dark imprints in the dewy grass. The apple trees, most planted decades before Harold had purchased the property, stood like patient sentinels, their branches heavy with fruit. Over the years, Harold had learned to care for them, pruning away dead wood and fighting off pests with a mixture of modern methods and old-fashioned vigilance. The airy, northeast corner of the orchard was Harold's favorite, situated on a gentle slope that caught the morning sun perfectly. The Honeycrisp trees there were younger than the rest, planted by Harold himself in his first year of retirement. He had nursed them through difficult early seasons, and now they rewarded him with spectacular yields of crisp, sweet apples that had developed a following at the market. Harold set down his tool bag beneath the first tree and extracted his pruning shears. He began work on a low-hanging branch, carefully removing a section that showed signs of disease. The methodical work allowed his mind to wander, as it often did these days, through memories of his life with Margaret, the thousands of students he had taught over the years, and the quiet contentment he had found in this unexpected chapter of his life. By mid-morning, Harold had worked his way through several trees, piling the trimmed branches neatly for later disposal. He paused to stretch his back, which had begun to complain about the morning's labor. The orchard was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant call of a crow. Harold took a deep breath, savoring the scent of ripening apples that perfumed the air. It was during this moment of quiet appreciation that Harold first noticed something amiss. A subtle change in the atmosphere caught his attention, a stillness that felt different from the peaceful quiet of minutes before. His eyes scanned the rows of trees, decades of teacher's instinct, telling him something had shifted. At first he saw nothing unusual, just his beloved trees standing in perfect rows against the backdrop of Vermont's rolling hills and the distant line of the Green Mountains. Then a movement in his peripheral vision drew his attention to a tree, about 50 yards away. Harold froze, his pruning shears suspended in mid-air. Among the branches of one of his older McIntosh trees was a large, dark shape that certainly didn't belong there. Harold squinted, wishing he'd brought his reading glasses from the house. The shape moved again, and Harold's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. A black bear, and not a small one, was perched in the tree, its powerful paws wrapped around a branch as it systematically tore apples from their stems and devoured them with evident pleasure. Harold had known, of course, that bears were present in this part of Vermont. In his years at the property, he'd seen tracks occasionally and had heard stories from neighbors about sightings and encounters. But in his 5 years tending the orchard, he had never actually seen one on his property. The Department of Fish and Wildlife sent out regular advisories each spring and fall about bear activity, and Harold had always taken the recommended precautions, securing his trash in a bear-proof container, bringing bird feeders inside during bear season, and being mindful when walking the more wooded sections of his property. But he had never seriously considered the possibility of encountering a bear in his orchard in broad daylight. The creature was larger than Harold had imagined black bears to be, its coat a glossy black that caught the sunlight as it moved among the branches. It seemed utterly unconcerned about Harold's presence as it continued to feast on the ripe McIntosh apples. Harold's first instinct was to back away slowly. Everything he had read about bear encounters emphasized the importance of not surprising the animal and giving it plenty of space. He took one careful step backward, then another, his eyes never leaving the bear. His plan was simple: retreat. To the house, call the game warden, and let professionals handle the situation. The bear, however, had other ideas. Perhaps alerted by Harold's movement, or having satisfied its immediate hunger, it began to climb down from the tree with surprising agility for such a large animal. Harold froze again, uncertain whether continuing to move would attract more attention. The bear dropped to the ground with a heavy thud and stood on all fours, its head swinging side to side as if surveying its surroundings. Then, to Harold's dismay, the bear's gaze seemed to lock onto him. For a long moment, man and bear stared at each other across the neat rows of apple trees. Harold's heart pounded in his chest, but he fought to remain calm, remembering everything he'd read about bear encounters. Make yourself look big. Don't. Run. Back away slowly, speak in a calm, assertive voice. Hey there, Harold said, his voice sounding strange and strained to his own ears. Just heading back to the house now. No need to worry about me. The bear watched him impassively, its small eyes unreadable. It seemed neither threatened nor particularly interested, which Harold took as a positive sign. Still speaking in a steady stream of calm reassurances, as much to himself as to the bear, Harold continued his slow retreat, moving diagonally toward the western edge of the orchard, which would allow him to circle around to the house without moving directly toward or away from the bear. For a few tense moments, the strategy seemed to be working. The bear remained where it was, occasionally sniffing the air but making no move to follow Harold. Harold had covered perhaps 20 yards of his retreat when the situation changed abruptly. A loud bang from the direction of the road, probably a car backfiring or a hunter's distant shot, broke the tense standoff. The bear's head jerked toward the sound and its whole demeanor changed in an instant. It dropped lower to the ground, its ears flattening against its head, and then, to Harold's horror, it began to move, not away from the sound, but directly toward him. It wasn't charging, not exactly, but moving with purpose, covering ground with alarming speed. Harold's careful retreat turned into a less dignified scramble as he tried to maintain distance between himself and the advancing bear. The problem was that Harold was now heading deeper into the orchard, away from the safety of his house, but he didn't dare turn his back on the bear to change direction. "Hey, hey!" Harold called out, trying to sound authoritative rather than terrified. "Stop right there!" The bear paused momentarily at the sound of his raised voice, and Harold seized the opportunity to edge toward a different row of trees, hoping to work his way back toward the eastern side of the orchard and eventually to the house. He had dropped his pruning shears in his hasty retreat, leaving him without even that modest tool for defense. The bear resumed its advance, moving at an angle that seemed calculated to intercept Harold's path. It was this apparent strategy that sent a chill through Harold's core. Bears were supposed to be trying to avoid confrontation, not seeking it out. Had this one become habituated to humans? Was it sick or injured in some way that made it more aggressive? Harold had no time to consider these questions as he quickened his pace, no longer bothering with the pretense of calm retreat. He needed to get to the house, and quickly. The bear, perhaps interpreting his faster movement as a challenge or as prey behavior, increased its own speed in response. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse among the apple trees. Harold would dart between rows, trying to work his way eastward while the bear seemed determined to cut him off, forcing him further into the orchard's northern edge, away from the safety of the house. Harold was no longer young, and months of physical labor had kept him reasonably fit for his age, but he was no match for the bear's speed and power. His breath came in ragged gasps, and a stitch was beginning to form in his side. In desperation, Harold changed tactics. One of the advantages of knowing his orchard intimately was understanding its layout. About 100 yards to the north stood an old tool shed where Harold stored some of his orchard equipment. If he could reach it and get inside, it would at least provide temporary shelter while he figured out his next move. He made a break for it, finally turning his back on the bear and running as fast as his 68-year-old legs would carry him toward the weathered wooden structure. He could hear the bear behind him, its heavy footfalls and snorting breath spurring him on, despite the burning in his lungs and the sharp pain in his side. The shed door was secured with a simple latch, not locked with a key. Harold silently thanked his past self for not being more security conscious as he closed the distance to the shed. 20 yards, 10, 5. He could almost touch the door handle, and then his foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling face first onto the ground. The fall knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a crucial moment, Harold lay stunned, unable to move. He rolled onto his back just in time to see the bear looming over him, its massive form blocking out the sun, its hot breath visible in the cool autumn air. Time seemed to slow as Harold looked up into the face of the creature. This close, he could see the details of its face, the wet black nose twitching as it scented him, the small eyes regarding him with what seemed like curiosity rather than malice, the powerful muscles of its neck and shoulders moving beneath its glossy coat. In that moment of strange clarity, Harold remembered reading that playing dead was the recommended strategy for grizzly bear attacks, but for black bears, the advice was to fight back aggressively. The problem was that his body seemed incapable of following either strategy, frozen in terror as the bear lowered its head toward him. The first contact was almost gentle, the bear's nose pressing against Harold's chest, sniffing at the fabric of his flannel jacket. Then, as if making a decision, the bear's demeanor changed. It made a huffing sound, and before Harold could react, it swiped at him with one massive paw. The blow caught Harold on his left side, the bear's claws tearing through his jacket and, the shirt beneath, raking across his ribs with searing pain. Harold cried out, the sound seeming to come from somewhere outside himself. The bear reared back at his shout, then came down again, this time its teeth closing on Harold's right arm as he instinctively raised it to protect his face. The pain was immediate and intense, a white-hot lance that shot from his forearm to his shoulder. Harold screamed again, a primal sound of pure terror and agony. The bear shook its head much as a dog might shake a toy, and Harold felt something tear in his shoulder, a sickening pop followed by a new wave of pain that threatened to overtake his consciousness. In desperation, Harold kicked out with both legs, connecting with the bear's underside. Whether it was the unexpectedness of the counterattack or mere chance, the bear released its grip on Harold's arm and backed away a few steps, huffing and swaying its massive head from side to side. Harold scrambled backward, crab-like, using his uninjured arm and legs to push himself toward the shed. The bear watched him, making no move to follow immediately, which Harold took as a miraculous reprieve. His back hit the wall of the shed, and he used it to push himself to his feet, never taking his eyes off the bear. His right arm hung uselessly at his side, blood soaking the torn sleeve of his jacket. His left side burned where the bear's claws had raked him, and he could feel warm wetness spreading across his ribs. But he was upright, and the bear remained a few yards away, still watching but not advancing. With his left hand, Harold reached behind him for the door latch, fumbling blindly as he kept his gaze locked on the bear. His fingers closed around the metal handle and he pulled, feeling the door give way behind him. One step backward, then another, and he was inside the shed. With a final surge of desperate energy, he slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, sliding down to sit on the dirt floor. The shed was dim, with light filtering in through a single dusty window and the cracks between the weathered boards. Harold's breath came in ragged gasps as the adrenaline that had carried him to safety began to ebb, leaving him shaking and increasingly aware of the severity of his injuries. His right arm was a mess, with puncture wounds visible through the tattered remains of his sleeve. He couldn't move his fingers, and the whole limb throbbed with a deep, nauseating pain. Outside, he could hear the bear moving around, its heavy footfalls circling the shed. Occasionally, it would bump against the walls, causing the entire structure to shudder. Harold closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart and think clearly through the fog of pain and fear. He needed help. That much was obvious. His injuries were beyond anything he could handle on his own, and if the bear decided to force its way into the shed, the thin wooden walls wouldn't hold it back for long. His cell phone was in his jacket pocket, and with trembling fingers, he managed to extract it with his left hand. No signal. Of course, the northeast corner of his property had always been a dead zone for cell reception. Harold let out a bitter laugh that turned into a groan as the movement sent fresh pain shooting through his side. He was trapped in a tool shed with a potentially aggressive bear outside and no way to call for help. The irony wasn't lost on Harold that after surviving 4 decades teaching high school students, retirement was what might kill him. Margaret would have appreciated the dark humor of it, he thought, as he tried to assess his options. The shed contained various tools, rakes, hoes, his small tractor, useless without keys, and an assortment of gardening implements. Nothing. That would serve as a particularly effective weapon against a determined bear, but perhaps something he could use to make noise and hopefully scare it away. There was also a first aid kit hanging on the wall, put there years ago and probably expired, but better than nothing. Harold pulled himself to his feet, gritting his teeth against the pain. He needed to bandage his wounds to slow the bleeding, especially from his arm. Using primarily his left hand, he managed to retrieve the first aid kit from its hook and awkwardly open it on the small workbench that ran along one wall of the shed. Inside, he found bandages, gauze, antiseptic wipes, and various other supplies that, while old, seemed serviceable. With painful slowness, Harold removed his torn jacket and shirt, revealing the full extent of his injuries. 3 parallel gashes ran across his left side, oozing blood but not spurting, which he took as a good sign that no arteries had been severed. His right arm was worse, with deep puncture wounds from the bear's teeth. The shoulder looked distorted, probably dislocated from the violent shaking. Harold did the best he could with one hand, cleaning the wounds with antiseptic wipes that stung fiercely, then applying gauze pads and wrapping them with bandages. It was far from professional medical care, but it might keep him from bleeding out while he figured out his next move. As he worked, the sounds outside had changed. The bear seemed to have lost interest in the shed and moved away, its footfalls becoming more distant. Harold held his breath, listening intently. After several minutes of silence, he dared to hope that the bear had returned to the orchard or wandered off into the woods that bordered his property to the north. The question now was what to do. He could wait in the shed, hoping that Ethan or someone else would notice his absence and come looking for him. But that might not happen until evening, and Harold wasn't sure he could wait that long without proper medical attention. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped entirely, and the pain in his arm and shoulder was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Alternatively, he could try to make it back to the house. It was a risk if the bear was still in the area, but if he could reach the house, he could call for help and properly treat his wounds. The house was about 300 yards from the shed, across open ground for the most part, which would at least allow him to see the bear if it was still around. After weighing his options, Harold decided that moving toward the house was his best chance. He would stay alert and retreat to the shed if he spotted the bear. Having made his decision, Harold gathered his resolve, secured the makeshift bandages as best he could, and cautiously opened the shed door. The orchard lay peaceful in the midday sun, no sign of the bear visible from where Harold stood. He took a tentative step outside, then another, his eyes constantly scanning for any movement among the trees. The walk back to the house would normally take only a few minutes, but in his injured state, Harold knew it would be a much slower journey. He set out, keeping to the edge of the orchard, where the trees would provide some cover if needed, but avoiding the denser sections where a bear might be hiding. Each step sent waves of pain through his body, but Harold focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping the white farmhouse in sight as his goal. He had covered perhaps half the distance when he heard it, a rustling from the orchard to his right, then the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls on fallen leaves. Harold froze, his heart sinking as he spotted the bear emerging from between 2 apple trees about 30 yards away. It had apparently been feeding again, as evidenced by the remnants of apples around its muzzle. The bear spotted Harold almost immediately, raising its head and fixing him with that same unreadable stare. For a moment, neither moved, locked in a tense standoff just as they had been earlier. Harold calculated the distance to the house, still too far to reach, before the bear could overtake him if it decided to charge. There were no trees nearby, sturdy enough to climb, especially with his injuries, and no other shelter within reach. In that moment of terrible clarity, Harold realized he had only one option: to stand his ground and somehow convince the bear he wasn't worth the trouble. Drawing himself up to his full height, ignoring the screaming pain from his wounds, Harold raised his uninjured left arm above his head to make himself look larger. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. "Get out of here! Go on!" The bear flinched at his shout but didn't retreat. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, a posture that Harold recognized with dread as potentially aggressive. He continued to yell, stamping his foot on the ground and waving his good arm, hoping desperately that the display would be enough to deter another attack. For a breathless moment, it seemed to be working. The bear hesitated, shifting its weight from paw to paw as if uncertain. Harold pressed his advantage, taking a single step forward while maintaining his intimidating posture and continuing his shouting. It was the wrong move. The bear dropped to all fours and began to advance, not charging but moving with clear purpose toward Harold. Harold backpedaled, struggling to maintain his balance while keeping his eyes on the approaching animal. His foot caught on something, a fallen branch, a dip in the ground he couldn't tell, and he stumbled, his injured side screaming in protest as he fought to stay upright. The bear quickened its pace, and Harold knew with terrible certainty that he wouldn't be able to outrun it or fight it off in his condition. His mind flashed to the articles he'd read about surviving bear attacks. For black bears, fight back, target the nose and eyes, don't play dead. Easy advice to give from the safety of a desk. Much harder to follow when facing several hundred pounds of muscle and claw and tooth with a dislocated shoulder and bleeding wounds. As the distance between them closed rapidly, Harold braced himself for the impact, his good hand curling into a fist. If this was how it ended, he would at least go down fighting. The bear was less than 10 yards away when the roar of an engine shattered the tense confrontation. Both Harold and the bear turned toward the sound as Ethan's green John Deere tractor came barreling across the field from the direction of the road, horn blaring and engine revving far beyond its usual gentle put-put. The bear, startled by the noise and the rapidly approaching machine, hesitated only briefly before turning tail and lumbering away toward the northern edge of the property, quickly disappearing into the tree line. Harold's knees gave way and he sank to the ground, overwhelmed by relief and the aftermath of adrenaline. The tractor pulled up beside him, its engine cutting off abruptly as Ethan leaped from the seat. "Mr. Wilson, Jesus Christ, what happened?" Ethan's young face was pale with shock as he took in Harold's blood-stained clothing and makeshift bandages. "Bear," Harold managed, his voice sounding distant and strange to his own ears. "In the orchard. It attacked me by the shed. We need to get you to a hospital," Ethan said, already pulling out his cell phone. "Sarah," he called over his shoulder, and Harold noticed for the first time that Ethan's wife was running across the field toward them, her face a mask of concern. "Call 911, Ethan instructed as she reached them. "Tell them bear attack, serious injuries." Sarah nodded, already dialing as she knelt beside Harold, her free hand gently supporting his back. "I was heading back to drop off some feed I borrowed," Ethan explained as they waited for the emergency responders. "Saw you from the road and the bear too. Figured the tractor was the best way to scare it off." "Good thinking," Harold mumbled, finding it increasingly difficult to focus as the pain and blood loss took their toll. "Saved my life. Just hang in there, Mr. Wilson," Sarah urged, her voice sounding far away. "Help is coming. They said 5 minutes." Harold nodded, or thought he did, but the world was beginning to blur around the edges. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the distant wail of sirens and Sarah's hand clasping his uninjured one, anchoring him to consciousness for as long as possible. When Harold next opened his eyes, the familiar surroundings of his orchard had been replaced by the sterile white of a hospital room. For a moment he struggled to piece together what had happened, his mind foggy with what he assumed were painkillers. The steady beep of a heart monitor and the slight pinch of an IV in his left hand confirmed his location. Slowly, the events of the day came back to him: the bear in the apple tree, the attack by the shed, Ethan's timely arrival on the tractor. Harold tried to sit up and was immediately reminded of his injuries as pain flared in his side despite the medication. His right arm was immobilized in a complex sling arrangement, and he could feel thick bandages around his torso. "Easy there." "Mr. Wilson," came a gentle voice from his left. A nurse in blue scrubs approached the bed, adjusting something on one of the monitors. You don't want to pull those stitches. How bad is it? Harold asked, his voice raspy from disuse. You've got 3 deep lacerations on your left side that required quite a few stitches, multiple puncture wounds on your right arm, and a dislocated shoulder that Dr. Mercer popped back into place. While you were unconscious, the nurse explained matter-of-factly, you've lost some blood, but not enough to need a transfusion, and there's no sign of infection yet, though we've got you on preventative antibiotics. All things considered, you're a very lucky man. Lucky wasn't the word Harold would have chosen, but he understood what she meant. Bear attacks were often fatal, and he had escaped with injuries that, while serious, would heal with time. Your neighbors are in the waiting room, the nurse continued. They've been here since you were brought in. The young woman, Sarah, I believe, said to tell you that she called your daughter in Boston, and she's on her way. Harold nodded, grateful for Sarah's thoughtfulness. His daughter, Emily, would be worried sick, but it would be good to see her. They had grown closer in the years since Margaret's death, with Emily making the 4-hour drive from Boston more frequently to check on him. There's also a game warden who wants to speak with you when you're up to it, the nurse added. Apparently, there's some paperwork that needs to be filled out regarding the bear. I can talk to him, Harold said, feeling more alert now, and I'd like to see Ethan and Sarah too, if that's all right. The nurse checked his vitals once more, seemingly satisfied with what she found. I'll let them know. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your treatment plan, but you're going to need to stay with us for at least a couple of days for observation. After she left, Harold took stock of his surroundings. The room was small but private, with a window overlooking what appeared to be a parking lot. From the quality of light, he guessed it was late afternoon or early evening, meaning he hadn't been unconscious for too long. His clothes were nowhere to be seen, probably cut off him in the emergency room, and he was dressed in a standard hospital gown. True to the nurse's word, Dr. Mercer arrived a few minutes later, a middle-aged woman with short grey hair and a direct manner that Harold appreciated. Mr. Wilson, I'm Dr. Mercer. I treated you when you were brought in, she said, consulting the chart in her hands. How's the pain level? On a scale of 1 to 10. About a 6, Harold admitted. Manageable, but definitely there. That's to be expected. We can adjust your pain medication if needed, but we're trying to keep you lucid enough to monitor for signs of infection or other complications. She set down the chart and approached the bed, her expression softening. Slightly? I understand you had quite an encounter with a black bear. That's putting it mildly, Harold replied with a weak attempt at humor. Well, as bear attacks go, you were relatively fortunate. The injuries to your side didn't penetrate. The abdominal cavity, and while the puncture wounds on your arm are deep, they missed major blood vessels and nerves. The shoulder dislocation is a standard anterior type that we reduced without complications. She proceeded to explain his treatment. Plan: IV antibiotics for at least 48 hours, regular wound checks, physical therapy for his shoulder once the acute injuries had healed somewhat, and eventually a follow-up with his primary care physician after discharge. Will there be permanent damage? Harold asked, thinking about his orchard and the physical labor it required. Dr. Mercer considered the question carefully. You'll have scarring, certainly, and the shoulder may never be quite as strong as it was before, though physical therapy will help significantly. At your age, recovery will be slower than for someone younger, but there's no reason you can't return to most of your normal activities eventually, with some modifications perhaps. It wasn't the unequivocal reassurance Harold had hoped for, but it was honest, and he appreciated that. After answering a few more questions about his medical history and medications, Dr. Mercer left, promising to check on him again in the morning. Shortly afterward, the nurse returned to inform him that the game warden was ready to speak with him if he felt up to it. Harold nodded his agreement, and a few moments later, a tall man in the green uniform of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department entered the room. Mr. Wilson, I'm Warden Mike Callahan, he introduced himself, shaking Harold's left hand carefully. I understand you had an encounter with a black bear on your property today. That's right, Harold confirmed. In my apple orchard in East Middlebury. Warden Callahan pulled up a chair beside the bed and took out a small notebook. I need to take an official report of the incident. It helps us track bear activity and problem bears in the region. Do you feel up to walking me through what happened? Harold recounted the events of the morning as clearly as he could remember them. Spotting the bear in the Macintosh tree, his attempted retreat, the first attack near the shed, and the second confrontation that was interrupted by Ethan's arrival on the tractor. The warden listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details, the bear's size and behavior, whether Harold had noticed any ear tags or other markings that might identify it as a bear. they were already tracking, and what exactly had triggered the initial charge. In your opinion, was the bear acting defensively or aggressively? Callahan asked, a question that caught Harold off guard. I'm not sure I understand the difference, he admitted. A defensive bear feels threatened and attacks to neutralize what it perceives as a danger, the warden explained. It typically displays warning signs first, huffing, jaw-popping, swatting the ground. An aggressive or predatory bear, on the other hand, is actively pursuing a target, often silently and with intent. It's an important distinction for how we handle the situation. Harold considered the question carefully. The first time when it came at me after that loud noise, it might have been startled and defensive, but the second time, when it approached me in the open field, there were no warning signs. It just saw me and started coming. Warden Callahan made a note, his expression giving nothing away. And you mentioned it was feeding on apples in your orchard. Have you had bear problems before? Never, Harold said. I've seen tracks occasionally, but this is the first time I've actually encountered one on my property. Do you keep any other potential attractants, bird feeders, unsecured trash, pet food outside? No, Harold replied, slightly defensive. I've read the department's advisories. My trash is in a bear-proof container. I don't have bird feeders up during bear season, and I don't have pets. The warden nodded, seemingly satisfied. The apples were likely the primary attraction then. It's been a dry summer, and natural food sources like berries and nuts are less abundant than usual. We've had an increase in reports of bears seeking out alternative food sources, including orchards and gardens. What happens now? Harold asked. With the bear, I mean. Callahan closed his notebook and tucked it into his shirt pocket. We'll set traps in the area near your property. Given the nature of the attack and the bear's behavior as you've described it, if we capture this bear, it will likely have to be euthanized. The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, but Harold felt a surprising pang of regret. Despite his traumatic experience, he didn't relish the thought of the animal being killed. It was, after all, just following its instincts in a year when its usual food sources were scarce. Is that really necessary? He asked. Couldn't it be relocated? Unfortunately, relocation rarely works with problem bears, especially ones that have attacked humans, Callahan explained. They often return to the same area or create problems in new locations. Our priority has to be public safety. Harold nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic, even if he didn't entirely agree with it. How will you know if you've got the right bear? We'll check its stomach contents for apples matching those in your orchard, examine its paws and teeth for any evidence like clothing fibers or, well, he glanced at Harold's bandaged arm. DNA evidence can sometimes be recovered from injuries, like yours as well. The clinical description made Harold slightly queasy, bringing back vivid memories of the attack that he'd been trying to push aside. Noticing his discomfort, Warden Callahan changed the subject. In the meantime, I'd like to offer some recommendations for when you return home, he said. Electric fencing around the orchard is highly effective at deterring bears. We can provide information on proper installation. Additionally, harvesting apples as soon as they're ripe rather than leaving them on the trees or ground reduces the attraction. I'll look into the fencing, Harold agreed. Though it'll be a while before I'm up to installing it myself. The department sometimes has volunteers who can help with projects like that, especially in cases where a resident has been injured, Callahan offered. I'll make a note in my report. After a few more questions and recommendations, the warden thanked Harold for his time and left his card on the bedside table. Call if you have any questions or if you spot the bear again. And for what it's worth, Mr. Wilson, you did most things right in a very difficult situation. Not everyone would have kept their wits about them the way you did. The compliment was unexpected, and Harold wasn't sure he deserved it. His actions had been more instinctive than calculated, but he appreciated the sentiment nonetheless. As Warden Callahan departed, Ethan and Sarah were allowed in, their faces lighting up with relief when they saw him conscious and talking. Mr. Wilson, thank God, Sarah exclaimed, hurrying to his bedside. We were so worried about you. Thanks to you two, I'm still here, Harold said with genuine gratitude. Ethan, that was some quick thinking with the tractor. Ethan shrugged modestly. Just lucky I was passing by and saw what was happening. Anyone would have done the same. Not everyone would have charged a bear with a garden tractor, Harold pointed out with a weak smile. I owe you my life. The young couple stayed for about 20 minutes, filling Harold in on what had happened after he lost consciousness. The ambulance had arrived quickly, and the paramedics had stabilized him at the scene before transporting him to Porter Medical Center in Middlebury. Ethan had followed in his truck, while Sarah stayed behind to speak with the game wardens who arrived shortly after the ambulance left. They've set up traps around the northern edge of your property, Sarah informed him, and they've posted warning Signs along the road about the bear activity. I heard they'll likely euthanize it if they catch it, Harold said, his feelings on the matter still conflicted. It's for the best, Mr. Wilson, Ethan said firmly. A bear that attacks people can't be allowed to roam free. Next time it could be a child or someone who can't fight back at all. Harold nodded, knowing Ethan was right from a practical standpoint, even if something in him still resisted the idea. Perhaps it was his decades as a history teacher, aware of how human expansion had continuously encroached on wildlife habitat, forcing adaptations that sometimes led to conflict. The conversation shifted to more immediate, practical concerns. Sarah had contacted Emily, who was driving up from Boston and would likely arrive later that evening. They had also secured Harold's house, bringing in his mail and making sure everything was locked up. Ethan promised to check on the property daily until Harold was discharged. And don't worry about the orchard, Ethan added. Sarah and I can handle the Honeycrisp harvest tomorrow. She'll take them to the market for you so you won't lose the income. Harold tried to protest that it was too much to ask, but the couple insisted. It's what neighbors do, Sarah said, simply in a tone that brooked no argument. After they left, Harold found himself alone with his thoughts. The events of the day played through his mind on repeat. The bear in the tree, the terrifying chase through the orchard, the searing pain of teeth and claws. Each time he closed his eyes, he could see the bear's face looming over him, feel its hot breath on his skin. A light tap on the door interrupted his unsettling reverie. The nurse poked her head in. Mr. Wilson, your daughter is here. Emily rushed in, her face tight with worry. At 39, she was the image of her mother at that age, with the same chestnut hair and gentle features, though Emily's professional life as a corporate attorney had given her a more polished appearance than Margaret had ever bothered with. Dad! She exclaimed, hurrying to his bedside and carefully embracing him, mindful of his injuries. When Sarah called, I thought, I was so worried. I'm okay, Emmy, Harold assured her, using the childhood nickname that he rarely employed these days. Banged up, but I'll heal. Emily pulled back, studying his face with the same analytical gaze she likely used in the courtroom. What happened? Sarah just said something about a bear attack. I drove up here imagining all sorts of scenarios. Harold recounted the story once more, trying to present a slightly less terrifying version for his daughter's benefit, though from her increasingly pale complexion, he didn't entirely succeed. You can't stay there anymore, Emily declared when he had finished. It's not safe. You should sell the place and move to Boston to be closer to me. It was an old suggestion, one that had come up periodically since Margaret's death, and Harold's answer hadn't changed. This is my home, Emmy. One bear encounter in 5 years doesn't change that. One bear encounter that nearly killed you, Emily retorted, her voice rising before she caught herself and continued more calmly. Dad, you're not a young man anymore. What if something like this happens again, and no one is around to help? Or what if you fall or have a heart attack, or any of the 1,000 other things that could go wrong when you're living alone in the middle of nowhere? East Middlebury is hardly the middle of nowhere, Harold pointed out mildly. And I have good neighbors, as you can see from today. You can't rely on the neighbors always being there at the right moment, Emily argued, but with less conviction. She had never been able to maintain her courtroom intensity when faced with her father's gentle stubbornness, a quality she had inherited in full measure. I'll make some changes, Harold offered as a compromise. The game warden suggested an electric fence around the orchard, which I'll definitely install. And I could look into one of those medical alert systems that you've mentioned before. Emily sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern of their conversation. She would push for a major life change. He would counter with a minimal concession. It had been their dance since she was a teenager. I'm staying until you're discharged, she stated. Not a question, but a declaration. I've already contacted the office and arranged to work remotely for the next week, and I'm hiring someone to help with the orchard and around the house while you recover. This time, Harold didn't argue. His independence was important to him, but he wasn't foolish enough to think he could manage the property with one functioning arm, at least not in the short term. And having Emily around for a week would be nice, despite the circumstances. That sounds reasonable, he agreed, earning a look of surprise from his daughter, who had clearly been prepared for more resistance. But no more talk of selling the place, at least not for now. Deal? Deal, Emily conceded, squeezing his good hand gently. For now. The next 2 days passed in a blur of medical routines, vital sign checks, wound dressings, physical therapy assessments, and a seemingly endless parade of medications. Emily remained a constant presence, advocating fiercely when she felt the hospital staff weren't being attentive enough and keeping Harold company during the long hours between medical interventions. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Mercer declared Harold ready for discharge, with strict instructions for wound care, antibiotic compliance, and physical therapy appointments. Emily listened attentively, taking notes on her phone and asking detailed questions about each aspect of his care. "Remember, Mr. Wilson," Dr. Mercer emphasized as she signed the discharge papers, "no lifting with that right arm for at least 6 weeks. The puncture wounds need time to heal completely, and the shoulder requires gentle rehabilitation according to the physical therapist's plan." "I understand," Harold assured her, eager to return home despite the limitations he would face. Emily had brought clothes for him, loose button-up shirts that could accommodate his bandages and sling, and comfortable pants with an elastic waistband that he could manage one-handed. Getting dressed was a slow, painful process, but Harold insisted on doing as much as he could himself. He would need to relearn many daily tasks, and the sooner he started, the better. The drive back to East Middlebury was quiet, Harold watching the familiar Vermont landscape roll by outside the car window. October had advanced during his hospital, the leaves now at their peak color, painting the hillsides in brilliant reds, oranges, and golds. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for working in the orchard. As they turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to his house, Harold noticed changes immediately. A large white truck was parked near the back door, and he could see figures moving in the orchard. "What's all this?" he asked, looking at Emily suspiciously. "The help I mentioned," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "I hired a local landscaping company to install the electric fence around the orchard, and Ethan and Sarah are here too, helping to coordinate and harvest the remaining apples." Harold wanted to protest the expense and the presumption, but the truth was, he was touched by his daughter's thoughtfulness. The fence would have been a significant undertaking, even when he was uninjured, and now it would have been impossible for months. "Thank you," he said simply, earning a surprised smile from Emily, who had clearly been bracing for an argument. The next week fell into a new routine. Emily worked remotely from Harold's dining table during the day, taking breaks to help him with meals and basic tasks. Harold found it frustrating to be so dependent, especially for simple things like buttoning his shirt or cutting his food, but he tried to accept the help graciously, knowing it was temporary. The landscaping crew completed the electric fence in 3 days, a sturdy 7-foot barrier that enclosed the entire orchard. It wasn't particularly attractive, but it was functional, with warning signs posted at regular intervals. The crew foreman gave Harold and Emily a thorough demonstration of how to operate the system, emphasizing the importance of regular maintenance and checking for shorts in the line after storms. Ethan and Sarah continued to help with the orchard, completing the Honeycrisp harvest and starting on the later varieties. They brought the proceeds from the farmer's market to Harold, who tried to insist they take a percentage for their work, but they steadfastly refused. "Just get better," Sarah told him firmly. "That's all the payment we want." On Harold's 5th day home, Warden Callahan stopped by to check on him and provide an update on the bear situation. They sat on the back porch, the October sunshine providing enough warmth to be comfortable despite the autumn crispness in the air. "We haven't captured anything in the traps yet," Callahan reported, "and there have been no further sightings in the immediate area. It's possible the bear has moved on to another territory." "So you think it's gone?" Harold asked, feeling both relieved and oddly disappointed. Part of him had wanted closure, a definitive end to the story. "Hard to say for certain," the warden replied. "Bears can have large territories, especially when food is scarce. It might return if it remembers the food source here, though the electric fence should prevent any access to the orchard itself." Callahan stayed for a cup of coffee, sharing stories of other bear encounters in the region, most far less dramatic than Harold's. Before leaving, he handed Harold a pamphlet about living safely in bear country, much of which Harold already knew but appreciated nonetheless. "We'll keep the traps up for another week," the warden said as he prepared to leave. "After that, we'll reassess based on any activity or sightings. In the meantime, I've noted your property as a site of concern, so any reports in this area will get immediate attention." That evening, as Harold and Emily sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the October sky in shades of pink and gold, Harold found himself reflecting on how the attack had changed him. The physical injuries would heal with time, leaving scars as reminders, but the psychological impact was more subtle and perhaps more profound. He had always felt at home in the natural world, comfortable with its rhythms and respectful of its creatures. Now he found himself scanning the tree line whenever he ventured outside, a new wariness coloring his relationship with the landscape he loved. He wondered if that heightened awareness would fade with time or become a permanent part of his engagement with his surroundings. "Penny for your thoughts," Emily said, interrupting his musings. "Just thinking about how quickly things can change," Harold replied. "A week ago, my biggest concern was whether the Honey Crisps would fetch a good price at the market." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "Life has a way of reminding us how unpredictable it can be. Your mother used to say that uncertainty was what made life interesting," Harold remembered with a small smile. "I always thought she was just trying to make me feel better about my tendency to worry about everything." "Mom was wise that way," Emily agreed. "She embraced the unknown in a way that I've never been able to match. Maybe that's why I became a lawyer, trying to impose order and rules on an inherently chaotic world." They fell silent again, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Harold knew Emily would be returning to Boston in a few days, her work responsibilities requiring her physical presence. They had arranged for a home health aide to visit 3 times a week to help with wound care and personal tasks, and Ethan and Sarah had promised to check in daily. "I'll be fine." "You know," Harold said, sensing his daughter's unspoken concern, "I'm getting better at doing things one-handed, and the aide will help with the rest." "I know," Emily acknowledged. "You've always been resilient. It's just hard to leave you when you're still recovering." "I recovered from losing your mother," Harold pointed out gently. "This is just a dislocated shoulder and some cuts. They'll heal." Emily reached over and squeezed his good hand. "Promise me you'll call if you need anything. Anything at all. I can be here in 4 hours." "I promise," Harold assured her, knowing he would likely never make that call unless it was truly an emergency. His independence was too important to him, a core part of his identity that even a bear attack couldn't shake. The following morning, they received an unexpected visitor. A tall, somewhat disheveled man in his 30s knocked on the door, introducing himself as Ben Murray from the Addison County Independent, the local newspaper. "I heard about your bear encounter, Mr. Wilson," he explained, notepad in hand. "We are doing a piece on increased bear activity in the region this fall, and your experience would make a compelling centerpiece for the article. Would you be willing to share your story?" Harold hesitated, not entirely comfortable with the idea of becoming a local news item. Emily, ever protective, stepped in. "My father is still recovering from serious injuries," she said firmly. "This isn't a good time for interviews." "It's all right, Emmy," Harold intervened, seeing the young reporter's crestfallen expression. "I don't mind talking about it if it might help others be more cautious." Ben's face brightened immediately. "That's exactly the angle we're taking. Education and awareness. The Fish and Wildlife Department is concerned about the uptick in human-bear interactions, especially as development pushes further into traditional bear habitat." Harold invited Ben to sit at the kitchen table, where he recounted his experience once more. The reporter took copious notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. He seemed particularly interested in Harold's description of the bear's behavior and the preventative measures he had subsequently taken, like the electric fence. "Do you mind if we take a photo for the article?" Ben asked when the interview was concluding. "Maybe of you in front of the new fence or showing your injuries, tastefully, of course." Harold declined the injury photos, but agreed to be photographed with the fence. They walked out to the orchard, where Ben snapped several shots of Harold standing beside the warning signs posted on the electric fence. "The article should run in Thursday's edition," Ben informed them as he packed up his camera. "I'll make sure you get a copy." After the reporter left, Emily expressed concern about the potential publicity. "Are you sure you want to be the face of bear attacks in Addison County? People might start showing up here, wanting to see where it happened or hear the story firsthand." "I doubt it will generate that much interest," Harold assured her. "It will be a small article in a local paper. Besides, if it helps even one person avoid a similar situation, it's worth a little discomfort." True to his word, Ben delivered a copy of the newspaper on Thursday morning. The article, titled "Bear Encounters on the Rise, Local Man Survives. Attack," appeared on the front page of the local section. The piece was well written, balancing Harold's personal experience with broader information about bear behavior and safety tips from the Fish and Wildlife Department. The photo showed Harold looking somber but resolute beside his new electric fence, his arm in its sling, visible evidence of his ordeal. "Not bad," Harold commented as he read through it. He stuck to the facts and didn't sensationalize too much. Emily seemed less convinced but admitted the educational elements of the article were valuable. "Just don't be surprised if you get some calls from neighbors or former students who read this," she warned. Emily's prediction proved accurate. Over the next few days, Harold received numerous calls and even a few visitors, former colleagues from the high school, neighbors from further down the road, and several ex-students who still lived in the area. Most expressed concern for his welfare and offered help with various tasks, which Harold politely but firmly declined in most cases. One visitor, however, was more persistent than the others. Marion Caldwell, a former colleague from the history department who had retired a few years before Harold, arrived with a casserole and a determined expression. "Don't even think about turning me away, Harold Wilson," she declared as she marched past Emily at the door. "I've known you for 30 years and I'm not about to let you waste away on takeout and whatever your well-meaning but culinarily challenged daughter is making." Emily raised her eyebrows at this assessment, but couldn't argue with its accuracy. Her busy professional life in Boston had never left much time for developing cooking skills beyond the basics. Marion, a widow in her early 70s with a no-nonsense manner that had served her well in corralling generations of teenagers, set up camp in Harold's kitchen and proceeded to fill his freezer with portion-sized meals that could be easily reheated one-handed. "These should last you a couple of weeks," she informed him as she labeled each container meticulously. "And I'll be back to restock when they run low, so don't think you're off the hook." Harold protested that it was too much trouble, but Marion waved away his objections. "What else am I going to do with my time? Sky Gardens put to bed for the winter, and there are only so many historical society meetings a person can attend before losing their mind. Let me do this." In truth, Harold was touched by the gesture. He and Marion had always gotten along well as colleagues, but had never developed a close friendship outside of school. Margaret had been his primary social connection, and after her death, Harold had withdrawn somewhat, focusing on the orchard rather than maintaining or building relationships. Emily departed for Boston the following day, extracting numerous promises from Harold about calling if he needed help, following medical instructions to the letter, and not attempting any orchard work until cleared by the doctor. Harold agreed to everything, knowing it was the only way to assuage her worry, though privately he had already been contemplating some light pruning that could be managed one-handed once she was gone. The home health aide, a cheerful woman named Dorothy in her 50s, arrived as scheduled 3 times a week. She changed Harold's bandages, helped him with exercises prescribed by the physical therapist, and assisted with household tasks that were still challenging with one arm. Dorothy had a matter-of-fact approach to caregiving that Harold appreciated, professional but not clinical, helpful but not hovering. Life settled into a new routine as October gave way to November. The orchard season wound down, with Ethan and Sarah harvesting the last of the late varieties before the first hard frost. Harold, to his surprise, found that he didn't mind delegating the work as much as he had expected. There was something satisfying about seeing the young couple's enthusiasm for the tasks he had taught them and their careful attention to his. Instructions suggested they might have a future in agriculture themselves. His injuries healed slowly but steadily. The stitches in his side were removed after 2 weeks, leaving 3 parallel pink scars that the doctor assured him would fade, somewhat with time. The puncture wounds on his arm were deeper and required longer to heal completely, but by early November he had graduated from the sling to a less restrictive brace that allowed for gentle movement as prescribed by the physical therapist. The bear never returned, or if it did, it was deterred by the electric fence. Warden Callahan removed the traps after 2 weeks of inactivity, though he continued to check in with Harold periodically, both professionally and increasingly in a more friendly capacity. The warden, it turned out, had a keen interest in local history and enjoyed discussing the evolution of Vermont's landscape and communities with Harold. The article in the Addison County Independent generated more interest than Harold had anticipated. A reporter from a Burlington television station contacted him about doing a feature on bear safety, using his experience as a cautionary tale. Harold politely declined, not comfortable with the idea of appearing on television and rehashing the traumatic event for a wider audience. "Once was enough," he told Ethan when recounting the call. "I don't need to become the bear attack poster boy for the entire state." Ethan nodded in understanding. People are fascinated by these kinds of stories. Makes them feel like they've brushed with something wild and dangerous, but from a safe distance. As November progressed and the Vermont landscape transformed from autumn brilliance to the stark beauty of early winter, Harold found his strength returning gradually. The physical therapist was pleased with his progress, though she cautioned that full recovery would take months, not weeks, and that some limitation in his range of motion might be permanent. The shoulder joint is complex, she explained during one session, manipulating his arm gently through a series of exercises. When it's been traumatically dislocated and there's additional tissue damage from the bite wounds, we can expect some long-term effects, but with consistent work, you should regain most functionality. Harold accepted this assessment with equanimity. At 68, he was realistic about the aging process and the body's diminishing capacity for complete healing. What mattered was regaining enough function to maintain his independence and continue the work he loved in the orchard, even if some tasks might require modification or assistance in the future. Marion continued her regular visits, expanding her role beyond meal provider to chess opponent and conversation partner. Harold found himself looking forward to her twice-weekly appearances, their discussions ranging from local politics to historical debates, to Harold's gradual adaptation to his post-attack life. "You seem different," Marion observed one evening in late November as they sat by the fireplace, a chessboard between them. Not just the physical changes, but something else. Harold considered this as he contemplated his next move. "I suppose an experience like that changes a person," he said, finally moving his knight. "Makes you aware of your mortality in a very immediate way." "It's more than that," Marion persisted, countering his move with a bishop that threatened his queen. "You're more present somehow, less trapped in your own head." The observation startled Harold with its accuracy. Since the attack, he had noticed a shift in his perception of everyday moments. The simple pleasure of a hot cup of coffee on a cold morning, the satisfaction of reading a good book by the fire, the companionship of friends like Marion, or the Parkers, things he had taken for granted or moved through somewhat automatically in the years since Margaret's death. "I think you're right," he acknowledged. "Nearly dying has a way of making you pay attention to living." Marion nodded, satisfied with this confirmation of her insight. "Margaret would be pleased," she said matter-of-factly. "She always worried that you would retreat into yourself after she was gone. Seems like it took a bear to push you back out into the world." The comment might have stung coming from someone else, but Marion's straightforward manner and long acquaintance with both Harold and Margaret gave her words a ring of truth that Harold couldn't deny. He had withdrawn after losing Margaret, finding solace in the solitary work of the orchard rather than in human connections. As winter settled fully over Vermont, blanketing the landscape in snow and bringing the short, crystal-clear days of December, Harold continued his recovery. By Christmas, he had regained enough strength and mobility to manage most daily tasks without assistance, though Dorothy still visited once a week to help with exercises and the more challenging aspects of household maintenance. Emily came home for the holidays, bringing her boyfriend, Mark, a fellow attorney, whom Harold had met on several previous occasions. Harold was pleased to see genuine concern in Mark's inquiries about his recovery and interest in the orchard's prospects for the coming year. "Sarah sent us weekly updates," Emily explained as they sat around the dining table on Christmas Eve, enjoying Marion's contribution to the holiday meal, a magnificent roast with all the trimmings. "She said you've been pushing yourself with the physical therapy within the doctor's guidelines," Harold clarified, not wanting to spark unnecessary worry. "And it's paying off. Dr. Mercer says I'm ahead of schedule for someone my age." "Dad's always been stubborn," Emily told Mark with a fond smile. "Once he sets his mind to something, there's no stopping him. A quality he passed on to his daughter," Harold remarked dryly, earning a laugh from Mark and a mock-offended look from Emily. The conversation turned to plans for the orchard in the coming year. Harold had been researching adaptive tools that would make certain tasks easier with his still-recovering arm and had hired a local high school student, Jason, to help with the heavier work during the spring pruning season. "Ethan and Sarah have been invaluable," Harold told them, "but they have their own farm to run. Jason's looking for agricultural experience before college, so it works out well for both of us." Emily seemed pleased by these pragmatic adjustments. Her earlier concerns about Harold's ability to manage the property somewhat assuaged. "And the electric fence is working?" she asked. "No more bear sightings?" "Not a one," Harold confirmed, though Warden Callahan says they're mostly in hibernation by now. "Anyway, the real test will be in the spring when they become active again." After dinner, as they sipped hot cider by the fire, Mark asked the question that Harold had been fielding from various quarters since the attack. "Do you ever worry about it happening again? I mean, does being outside in the orchard make you nervous now?" It was a fair question, one that Harold had asked himself many times over the past months. "At first, yes," he admitted. "For weeks. After I came home, I'd find myself scanning the tree line constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds, but that's faded with time. And the fence helps, I imagine." Mark suggested. It does, Harold agreed. But it's more than that. I've made my peace with what happened. The bear was doing what bears do, looking for food in a year when natural sources were scarce. It wasn't personal or malicious, just nature following its course, and me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's very philosophical of you, Emily remarked, a hint of admiration in her voice. I'm not sure I could be so understanding if something tried to eat me. Harold chuckled. Well, to be fair, it wasn't trying to eat me, just drive me away from what it perceived as its food source, and in a way the whole experience has been, I don't want to say positive exactly, but clarifying. How so? Mark asked, genuinely interested. Harold considered the question carefully. It reminded me that I'm still here, still part of the world. For a while after your mother died, he said, glancing at Emily, I was going through the motions, existing, but not really living. The bear, as strange as it sounds, woke me up, reminded me that every day is precious, even the ordinary ones, maybe especially the ordinary ones. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Harold's words lingered. In his own mind, long after Emily and Mark had retired to their rooms for the night, sitting alone by the dying fire, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past few months, from the terror of the attack to the pain of recovery, to this moment of quiet contentment in his home, surrounded by people who cared for him. The bear had disappeared back into the wilderness after Ethan drove it away, leaving Harold with wounds that would heal and scars that would remain. There had been no dramatic conclusion, no final confrontation or resolution, just a wild creature returning to its world and a human being left to make sense of the brief, violent intersection of their lives. In the spring, Harold knew he would return to his orchard with a new awareness of both its beauty and its place within the larger wilderness. The electric fence would stand as a boundary between his cultivated space and the wilder world beyond, a reminder of the encounter that had nearly ended his life, but had, in a strange way, renewed it instead. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering the sleeping orchard in a blanket of white. Harold watched through the window, feeling the gentle tug of the scars on his side as he shifted in his chair, physical reminders of a day that had changed him in ways both visible and invisible. The bear was out there somewhere, perhaps sleeping through the winter in a den, perhaps roaming in search of food, its brief encounter with Harold as forgotten as yesterday's weather. But Harold would remember, not with fear or resentment, but with a peculiar gratitude for the reminder of his own place in the natural world, neither its master nor its victim, but a participant in its endless cycles of growth and loss, peace and violence, ending and beginning again. In the darkness beyond the window, snow continued to fall on the orchard, on the forest, on the sleeping bears and all the wild creatures that shared this landscape, indifferent to human concerns, following their ancient patterns. Through the turning seasons, Harold watched until his eyes grew heavy, then banked the fire and made his way to bed, carrying the memory of tooth and claw, of fear and survival, and of the strange, unexpected gift of renewed appreciation for the life that continued, one ordinary, precious day at a time. The morning air carried a crisp bite as Scott Davis made his way along the winding trail that cut through Yosemite's dense woodland. The tall pines swayed gently in the early breeze, their needles rustling like whispered conversations. At 42, Scott had been a park ranger at Yosemite National Park for nearly 15 years, and the familiar scent of pine and earth still filled him with the same sense of purpose it had on his first day. His weathered ranger hat, a shade lighter than it had been when first issued, sat comfortably on his head, shielding his eyes from the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. The dark green of his uniform blended with the surrounding forest, a deliberate design choice that allowed rangers to move through the park without disrupting the natural experience for visitors or wildlife. Scott checked his watch. 6:30 a.m. The early patrol was his favorite shift. Tourism at Yosemite had been steadily increasing over the years, with nearly 4 million visitors annually cramming into the valley during peak seasons. But at this hour, the human presence was minimal. The park belonged to the wildlife, and Scott preferred it that way. He adjusted the radio on his belt, a constant companion that connected him to the other rangers spread throughout Yosemite's 750,000 acres of wilderness. His handheld GPS showed his position on the northern edge of the Lower Pines campground, an area that had reported increased bear activity over the past week. Sullivan to Davis, the radio crackled to life. How's the Lower Pines looking this morning? Any sign of our furry friends? Scott unclipped the radio and pressed the talk button. Davis to Sullivan. Nothing yet. Just started the sweep. but I did notice some overturned trash near campsite. 12 yesterday evening. Asked the campers to secure their food in the bear lockers. I'll check if they complied." "Roger that," replied Linda Sullivan, the senior ranger coordinating from headquarters. "Keep an eye out. Yesterday we had 3 separate bear sightings reported by hikers near Vernal Fall. One mentioned cubs." Scott's expression grew more serious. "Cubs? First I've heard of it. That means Mama Bear is around too. I'll stay alert. That's why I'm telling you now. Information just came in late last night. Park biologists think it might be the same female we tagged last spring, number 457. She's had run-ins with campers before." Scott remembered Bear 457, a large female black bear weighing approximately 320 pounds with a distinctive white patch on her chest. She had earned a reputation among the rangers for her bold behavior, often venturing into camping areas despite deterrent efforts. Black bears weren't typically aggressive toward humans, but a mother with cubs was a different story altogether. Protective instincts overrode their usual cautious behavior around people. "I'll keep my distance if I spot her," Scott assured Linda. "Any other reports I should know about?" "Nothing urgent, just the usual. Couple of unprepared hikers needed water rescue near Emerald Pool yesterday afternoon. And be advised, Weather Service says there might be afternoon thunderstorms, so keep an eye on the sky." Scott acknowledged the information and clipped the radio back onto his belt. The morning sunlight was growing stronger now, illuminating the valley and casting long shadows from the imposing granite monoliths that made Yosemite famous worldwide. Half Dome and El Capitan stood as ancient sentinels, unchanged for millennia, while the world beneath them transformed. Scott paused to take in the view, appreciating how the golden light painted the landscape. These quiet moments were what kept him coming back year after year, despite the increasing challenges of the job. The ranger continued his patrol, methodically checking each campsite for any violations or potential wildlife attractants. Most campers were still asleep in their tents, though a few early risers were quietly preparing coffee on camping stoves. Scott nodded politely as he passed, offering a quiet good morning to those who made eye contact. He had always balanced his roles as enforcer of park regulations and ambassador for the natural world, preferring education over citations whenever possible. As Scott approached Campsite 12, he noted with satisfaction that the family had heeded his advice. Their cooler and food supplies were properly stored in the metal bear locker, designed specifically to prevent wildlife from accessing human food. He made a mental note to commend them when they awoke. Too often, visitors underestimated the intelligence and strength of bears. A black bear could easily tear through a car window or thin-walled cooler if it smelled food inside. His inspection complete, Scott decided to extend his patrol to include a section of the woodland that bordered the campground. To the north, this area wasn't on his usual route, but with the reports of Bear 457 and her cubs, he wanted to establish a clearer picture of their movements. If necessary, the park management might need to temporarily close certain trails or campsites to reduce the chances of negative human-wildlife interactions. Scott veered off the main path, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. The underbrush was thicker here, away from the trampled paths that visitors typically used. He moved carefully, his experienced eyes scanning the ground for tracks or scat that might indicate recent bear activity. Years of ranger training and field experience had honed his tracking skills, allowing him to read the subtle signs most visitors would overlook. After about 20 minutes of methodical searching, Scott found what he was looking for: fresh bear scat, probably from earlier that morning. He crouched down to examine it more closely, noting the partially digested berries and plant material. Black bears were omnivores, with the bulk of their diet consisting of vegetation, insects, and berries, though they would opportunistically eat meat when available. The scat confirmed bear presence, but provided little information about whether it might be Bear 457 or another of Yosemite's estimated 300 to 500 black bears. Rising to his full height of 6 feet, Scott surveyed the area more thoroughly. About 10 yards away, he spotted claw marks on a ponderosa pine, a sign of territorial marking or possibly a bear sharpening its claws. The marks appeared fresh, the exposed inner bark still oozing sap. Scott estimated from the height of the marks that this was indeed a good-sized bear, consistent with 457's profile. He reached for his radio to update headquarters on his findings, but paused when a sound caught his attention. The distinct crack of breaking branches came from a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. Scott remained still, listening intently. Wildlife encounters were common in his line of work, but caution was always the protocol, especially when large, predators might be involved. The sound came again, followed by a low huffing noise that experienced rangers recognized immediately as a bear's stress vocalization. Scott slowly reached for his binoculars, bringing them to his eyes with deliberate, smooth movements to avoid creating sudden motion that might startle the animal. Through the lenses, he could make out the dark shape of a black bear moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. The white chest patch confirmed his suspicion. Bear 457. She was moving in an agitated pattern, pacing back and forth while periodically rising on her hind legs to sniff the air. Scott knew this behavior indicated anxiety, possibly because she sensed his presence but couldn't visually locate him due to the thick undergrowth. He lowered the binoculars and reached for his radio, keeping his movements slow, and his voice had a whisper. "Davis to headquarters. I've got a visual confirmation on Bear 457 in the wooded area north of Lower Pines, approximately quarter-mile from the nearest campsite. She's exhibiting stress behaviors. No visual on cubs yet, but I'm keeping my distance." Linda's voice came back immediately, slightly hushed as if matching his caution. "Roger that. Do you need backup?" "Negative," Scott replied quietly. "Just documenting the sighting. I'll keep observation from a safe distance and pull back if she moves toward the campground." "Understood. Keep us updated if anything changes." Scott kept his eyes on the bear as he secured the radio. Standard protocol was to maintain at least 100 yards distance from bears, especially one with a known history of human interactions. He began to slowly back away, planning to circle around and approach the campground from a different direction to avoid creating any additional stress for the animal. He had retreated about 10 yards when a new sound froze him in place, the distinctive whimper of bear cubs. The sound came not from the clearing where he had spotted 457, but from somewhere behind him, closer to the campground. A cold realization washed over Scott. He had inadvertently positioned himself between a mother bear and her cubs, perhaps the most dangerous wildlife situation a ranger could face. Scott's training kicked in immediately. Never run from a bear. It triggers their chase instinct. Make yourself look bigger, speak calmly but firmly, back away slowly if possible. He turned his head with deliberate slowness and spotted two small black bear cubs, probably 4 or 5 months old, tumbling playfully near the base of a large oak tree about 30 yards to his south. They seemed unaware of his presence, focused entirely on their roughhousing. The situation had suddenly become drastically more dangerous. Mother bears were fiercely protective of their young, and black bears, despite their usually shy nature around humans, could become extremely aggressive if they perceived a threat to their cubs. Scott needed to extract himself from between them without startling either the cubs or alerting the mother to his position relative to her young. He began to move laterally, attempting to clear a path between mother and cubs without approaching either. His heart rate had accelerated, but his breathing remained controlled. 15 years of ranger experience had taught him that panic was the enemy in wildlife encounters. The cubs continued their play, one chasing the other up the trunk of the oak tree a short distance before sliding back down. Scott had nearly cleared the direct line between mother and cubs when the wind shifted. A breeze that had been blowing from the west suddenly came from the south, carrying his human scent directly toward Bear 457. Scott knew immediately that the situation had deteriorated. Bear's sense of smell is exceptionally keen, 7 times more powerful than a bloodhound's, and 457 would now be aware not only of his presence, but also his position relative to her cubs. The reaction was instantaneous. A loud, bellowing woofing sound erupted from the clearing, followed by the crash of breaking underbrush. Through the trees, Scott could see 457 running in his direction, covering ground with alarming speed. Black bears can run up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human, and the mother was now in full protective charge. Scott reached for his bear spray, a concentrated capsaicin deterrent that rangers carried as a last resort. He had used it only twice in 15 years, and the effectiveness varied depending on wind conditions and the bear's momentum. As he unholstered the spray, he simultaneously began speaking in a firm, authoritative voice. "Hey bear, I'm backing away." The standard call sometimes worked to remind black bears that humans were not prey and that the encounter was not worth the risk. But 457 was not deterring. The massive bear burst through the final line of underbrush separating them, her 320 pounds of muscle and fur moving with surprising agility. She rose onto her hind legs about 15 yards from Scott, standing nearly 6 feet tall, her mouth open in a roar that seemed to reverberate through the forest. Scott aimed the bear spray, his finger on the trigger, but hesitated. The shifting, Wind meant the spray might blow back into his own face, incapacitating him without stopping the bear. In that split second of decision, 457 dropped to all fours and charged. Davis to headquarters. Scott managed to shout into his radio before he had to abandon it to focus on the immediate threat. "Bear charge. North Woods, The radio call cut off as Scott was forced to dive to the side, narrowly avoiding the initial charge. The bear's momentum carried her past him, her massive paw swiping at the space where he had just been standing. The sheer power of the animal was terrifying up close. Each paw equipped with claws designed to tear through tough bark and dig up roots could easily rip through human flesh. Scott scrambled to his feet, still gripping the bear spray. The bear had already wheeled around for a second charge, her focus entirely on the perceived threat to her cubs. This time, Scott had no option but to use the spray. As 457 closed the distance, he depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of orange-tinted capsaicin spray toward the charging animal. Even with the unfavorable wind, enough of the deterrent reached the bear to have some effect. She flinched and shook her head violently, momentarily slowed by the burning sensation in her sensitive nose and eyes. The momentary reprieve gave Scott a chance to back toward a cluster of trees, hoping to find one sturdy enough to climb if necessary. Black bears are excellent climbers, but a tall enough tree might offer temporary safety. Before he could reach suitable cover, however, 457 recovered from the effects of the spray and refocused on him, her determination to protect her cubs overriding the discomfort. Scott's radio crackled with Linda's voice calling for a response, but it lay on the ground where he had dropped it during the initial evasion. He considered his options rapidly. The bear spray had been partially effective, but wouldn't stop a second charge. His sidearm, loaded with non-lethal beanbag rounds, was still holstered, but drawing and aiming it would require precious seconds he might not have. When 457 charged again, Scott tried to repeat his earlier evasion, diving to the side, but the uneven terrain betrayed him. His boot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling onto the forest floor. The momentary loss of balance was all the advantage the bear needed. Before Scott could regain his footing, he felt a searing pain as the bear's claws connected with his right leg, slicing through his uniform pants and into the flesh beneath. The initial shock of the injury barely registered as Scott rolled away, instinctively, trying to create distance. Bear attacks typically involve batting and clawing, rather than the prolonged mauling portrayed in films, with the animal attempting to neutralize a threat rather than prey on it. But with cubs involved, 457's protective instincts were in full control. The bear pursued his rolling motion, clamping powerful jaws on Scott's side. Even through his heavy uniform jacket, the pressure was excruciating. Scott struck at the bear's sensitive nose with his fist, a desperate move that momentarily loosened her grip. He used the split-second opportunity to scramble backward, leaving a smear of blood on the forest floor. "Hey, bear, hey!" A new voice echoed through the trees, followed by the sharp crack of a warning shot fired into the air. The unexpected noise caused 457 to hesitate, her head swiveling toward the sound. Two more rangers had responded to Scott's partial radio call, arriving just in time to witness the attack. Ranger Mike Two Feathers, a 35-year veteran of the National Park Service, stood at the edge of the clearing with his shotgun raised, loaded with non-lethal deterrent rounds. Beside him, Ranger Samantha Chen was already deploying an air horn, its blaring noise designed specifically to startle and deter predators. The combined stimuli, the warning shot, the air horn, and the presence of two more humans created enough confusion to interrupt 457's attack. The bear backed several paces away from Scott, huffing and woofing in agitation, torn between continuing to neutralize the perceived threat and retreating to protect her cubs. "Don't move, Scott," Mike called. Out, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his stance. "Sam, cover me." Mike began to slowly advance, the shotgun trained on the ground in front of the bear, ready to fire beanbag rounds if necessary. These non-lethal projectiles deliver a painful impact without causing permanent injury, usually sufficient to drive off even a determined bear. Behind him, Samantha maintained a constant noise with the air horn while also unholstering her bear spray. "Cubs, south," Scott managed to say through gritted teeth, the pain from his injuries now fully registering as adrenaline began to ebb. "She's protecting cubs." Mike nodded his understanding without taking his eyes off the bear. "Sam, we need to create a clear path between her and those cubs. Move right, slowly." The two rangers executed a well-practiced maneuver, positioning themselves to allow 457 a clear route to her cubs, while simultaneously covering Scott's vulnerable position. The bear continued to huff and pace, but her attention was increasingly divided between the newcomers and the direction of her cubs, who had fallen silent, likely hiding in response to the commotion. "If I can reach my radio," Scott said, trying to sit up despite the pain radiating from his leg and side. "I can call for medical." "Already done," Samantha assured him, the air horn still in her left hand while her right maintained a grip on her bear spray. "Backup and medical are en route. Just stay still." Bear 457 made a sudden lunge toward Mike, who responded with a beanbag round, fired into the ground directly in front of her. The impact kicked up dirt and pine needles, and the loud report of the shotgun caused the bear to flinch back. She rose up on her hind legs again, a final show of intimidation, before dropping back to all fours and backing away toward the direction of her cubs. "She's retreating," Mike said, his voice still measured. "Keep the noise up, Sam. Let's make sure she continues in that direction." The strategy worked. With a final huff, 457 turned and lumbered toward her cubs, disappearing into the underbrush from which they had emerged. The sound of breaking branches marked her retreat, growing fainter as she put distance between her family and the humans. Only when the forest had fallen relatively quiet did Mike lower his shotgun and move quickly to Scott's side. "How bad?" he asked, already reaching for the first aid kit attached to his belt. Scott grimaced as he attempted to assess his own injuries. "Legs pretty torn up. Side feels like cracked ribs at least. Maybe worse where she bit down. But I don't think anything's broken." Samantha maintained vigilance, scanning the trees while Mike performed a rapid first assessment of Scott's wounds. The claw marks on his right leg had torn through muscle, creating deep lacerations that were bleeding steadily, but not arterially. The bite to his side had been partially absorbed by his heavy uniform and the utility belt beneath it, but there were still puncture wounds that would require immediate medical attention. "You're lucky," Mike said, as he applied pressure bandages to the leg wounds. "If Sam and I hadn't been already nearby doing backcountry patrol, this could have gone much worse." Scott nodded, wincing as Mike tightened the bandage. "Thanks for the timely arrival. How did you know where to find me?" "Linda dispatched us the moment your radio cut out," Samantha explained, finally lowering the air horn as the likelihood of the bear's return diminished. "Said you reported a bear charge. We were only about 10 minutes away on the ridge trail." The sound of additional voices and footsteps announced the arrival of the park's emergency medical team. 2 rangers with advanced wilderness first aid training pushed through the underbrush, carrying a collapsible stretcher and more comprehensive medical supplies. "Bear attack," Mike informed them succinctly. "Victim is conscious and stable. Lacerations to right leg, puncture wounds and possible rib injuries to right side." The medical team took over, their movements efficient and practiced. One began cutting away the fabric of Scott's uniform around his injuries for better access, while the other established an IV line to administer fluids and pain medication. Scott, now feeling the full extent of his injuries as the last of the adrenaline faded, grunted in pain but remained alert. "Did you get a good look at the bear?" asked Linda Sullivan, who had arrived with the medical team and now crouched beside Scott. "Was it definitely 457? "Positive ID," Scott confirmed, his voice strained. "White chest patch. 2 cubs, probably born this spring. They're heading deeper into the North Woods now." Linda nodded, making notes on a small waterproof pad. "We'll need to file a full incident report. Fish and Wildlife Service will want details, and the park superintendent will need to make decisions about that area of the park." "It wasn't her fault," Scott said firmly, despite his pain. "I ended up between her and the cubs. Just bad luck. And timing." The comment was typical of Scott's approach to wildlife management. Throughout his career, he had advocated for understanding animal behavior rather than punitive measures when conflicts occurred. Black bears, despite their size and strength, typically avoided humans unless habituated to associate them with food or, as in this case, perceiving a threat to their young. "No one's blaming the bear," Linda assured him, "but we still need to follow protocol. For now, let's focus on getting you to medical care." The medical team had stabilized Scott's wounds as best they could in the field and now carefully transferred him to the stretcher. The extraction would be challenging. They were nearly a mile from the nearest access road, where an ambulance waited. The uneven terrain of the forest floor meant the team would need to carry Scott the entire way, a task that would require all 4 rangers, plus Linda, to rotate carrying responsibilities. As they secured Scott to the stretcher, Mike spoke quietly to Linda. "We should post warnings right away. Close this section of the trail system at least temporarily." Linda nodded. already in progress. I've got 2 more rangers setting up closure notices at all access points to this area. We'll reassess after tracking 457's movement patterns over the next 24 hours. The team began the laborious process of carrying Scott through the forest, taking care to choose the most even path possible to minimize jostling his injuries. Despite the pain medication now flowing into his system, each step the bearers took sent waves of discomfort through his wounded body. Scott clenched his jaw, focusing on his breathing to manage the pain. "You know," Mike said, attempting to distract Scott as they navigated a particularly rough section, "this is going to make quite the story for the new ranger orientation. This is why we maintain bear distance protocols and all that." Scott managed a pained smile. "If it helps the newcomers take the protocols seriously, I guess something good comes from this." The journey to the access road took nearly 45 minutes, with the team rotating positions frequently to prevent exhaustion. When they finally emerged from the tree line, the waiting ambulance crew immediately moved forward with a gurney to transfer Scott from the stretcher. The medical technicians, already briefed on the nature of his injuries, wasted no time in preparing him for transport to the nearest hospital capable of handling trauma cases. "Mariposa General is ready for you," one of the EMTs informed Scott as they loaded him into the ambulance. "They've got their best trauma surgeon on standby." Scott nodded weakly, the combination of pain, medication, and blood loss beginning to take a toll on his consciousness. As the ambulance doors closed, he caught a last glimpse of his fellow rangers, Mike, Samantha, and Linda, standing together at the edge of the forest where he had spent so much of his life protecting both the wilderness and those who came to experience it. The ambulance sped away from Yosemite Valley, sirens wailing as it navigated the winding roads that led out of the park. Inside, the EMTs continued monitoring Scott's vital signs while administering additional fluids to compensate for blood loss. One of them cut away more of his uniform to better examine the extent of the injuries now that they had proper lighting and equipment. "Bear, God, you good," the EMT commented professionally, inspecting the deep lacerations on Scott's leg. "But you're lucky. Claws missed the major arteries and tendons. The bite on your side is more concerning. We need to watch for signs of internal bleeding." Scott drifted in and out of full awareness as the ambulance made its way to Mariposa, a small town about 30 miles from the heart of Yosemite that served as the nearest medical hub for park emergencies. The hospital there wasn't large, but it maintained trauma capabilities specifically because of its proximity to wilderness areas where accidents and injuries regularly occurred. Upon arrival at Mariposa General Hospital, Scott was immediately wheeled into the emergency department, where a team led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the trauma surgeon on call, was waiting. The bright lights of the examination room brought Scott back to full consciousness temporarily as the medical team transferred him from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed. "Ranger Davis, I'm Dr. Rodriguez," the surgeon introduced herself, already examining his wounds as nurses cut away the remainder of his clothing. "You've had quite the encounter. Can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? 8, Scott managed, his voice hoarse. "Maybe 9 when you touch near the bite." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her expression focused as she gently probed the wounds. "We're going to take you for some scans to check for internal injuries, then likely straight to surgery. Bear attacks carry high risk of infection, so we'll need to thoroughly clean these wounds and possibly place drains. I'm also concerned about potential damage to your liver from the bite location." Scott understood the seriousness of his situation. Wildlife attack injuries were fundamentally different from typical traumatic wounds. The combination of teeth, claws, and the bacteria present in a wild animal's mouth created complex medical challenges. He had assisted in evacuating injured hikers before, but experiencing it from the patient's perspective was disorienting. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Scott underwent CT scans that revealed, thankfully, no major internal organ damage, though there was significant soft tissue trauma and 3 cracked ribs where the bear's jaws had clamped down. The most severe injuries were the deep lacerations to his right leg, which required extensive surgical debridement and over 60 stitches across 4 separate wounds. When Scott finally emerged from anesthesia in the recovery room, the clock on the wall showed it was nearly 6 p.m., almost 12 hours since he had begun his morning patrol. The dull throb of pain was held at bay by medication, but consciousness brought with it the full realization of what had happened and how fortunate he had been to survive. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached his bedside. "Welcome back. Ranger Davis, Dr. Rodriguez will be by shortly to discuss your surgery. You have some visitors waiting as well, other rangers. Would you like to see them?" Scott nodded, his mouth too dry to speak comfortably. The nurse offered him a small sip of water through a straw before stepping out to notify the doctor and his colleagues. A few minutes later, Linda Sullivan entered the room, followed by Mike Two Feathers. Both still wore their ranger uniforms, though they had removed their utility belts and hats. "You look better than I expected," Linda said, approaching the bed with a relieved smile. "Though I guess anyone would look better than when they're being carried out of the woods on a stretcher. How are you feeling, man?" Mike asked, his normally stoic expression softened with concern. Scott took another sip of water before responding. "Like I got hit by a truck, but I'm alive, which is the important part. Any word on 457 and her cubs?" Linda and Mike exchanged glances before Linda answered. "Wildlife management team tracked them deeper into the north section of the park. They've established a perimeter around that entire area, about 5 square miles, that will remain closed to visitors for at least the next week. 457 seems to have settled down with the cubs about 3 miles from where the incident occurred." "Good," Scott said, visibly relieved. "I was worried they might decide she needs to be relocated or worse." "There's been some discussion," Mike admitted. "Fish and Wildlife has been notified, as required for any bear attack resulting in human injury. But initial assessment is leaning toward classifying this as a defensive attack rather than predatory behavior. The fact that she retreated once her cubs were no longer perceived to be threatened works in her favor." Before Scott could respond, Dr. Rodriguez entered the room, tablet in hand, as she reviewed his medical information. "Ranger Davis, good to see you alert. Your surgery went well. We cleaned and repaired the lacerations on your leg, which were the most severe injuries. The bite wounds to your side were more superficial than we initially feared, though you do have 3 cracked ribs that will take time to heal. What's the recovery timeline looking like?" Scott asked, already mentally calculating how long he would be away from his duties at the park. "You'll be here for at least 3 days for IV antibiotics and monitoring," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "Bear mouths carry a significant bacterial load, and infection is our primary concern at this point. After discharge, you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks before those leg wounds are healed enough for you to return to even limited duty. The ribs will take about the same time frame to heal. Physical therapy will be necessary to regain full strength and mobility in that right leg." Scott nodded, accepting the information stoically, though internally he was already chafing at the thought of such a long recovery period. The spring and summer months were the busiest for the park, and being short-staffed put additional pressure on his already overworked colleagues. "I've already spoken with the superintendent," Linda said, sensing his concern. "We're arranging coverage for your shifts. Focus on recovery, Scott. The park will still be there when you're healed." Dr. Rodriguez checked Scott's vital signs and adjusted his pain medication slightly before excusing herself, promising to return later in the evening to reassess his condition. Once she had left, Mike pulled up a chair beside the bed. "We need to discuss the incident report," he said, his tone shifting to the more formal one used for official park business. "Linda and I have filed the initial documentation, but we'll need your full account once you're feeling up to it. Fish and Wildlife is particularly interested in the specifics of the encounter." Scott sighed, knowing the bureaucratic process that followed any wildlife incident, especially one involving injury to park personnel, was extensive. "I can give you the basics now if you want to record it." Linda pulled out her phone and opened a recording app. "This isn't the official statement. That will need to be done with the proper forms, but it will help us get the details while they're fresh in your mind." For the next 20 minutes, Scott recounted the morning's events in as much detail as he could recall: his patrol route, the discovery of bear sign, spotting 457, the shift in the wind that had carried his scent to the mother bear, and the terrifying moments of the attack itself. Mike and Linda listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details like the bear's behavior before charging or the effectiveness of the bear spray. "The spray definitely had some effect," Scott explained, "but with the wind shifting, I didn't get a full discharge into her face. And a mother protecting cubs has a much higher tolerance for deterrence. Her protective instinct overrode the discomfort." "This could be valuable for training," Mike commented. "Most of our newer rangers have never experienced an actual bear encounter beyond observing them from a safe distance. Your first-hand account of deterrent limitations could improve our protocols." When Scott had finished his account, Linda stopped the recording and tucked the phone away. "I'll transcribe this tonight and use it to complete the preliminary report. The superintendent wants to discuss the incident at tomorrow morning's staff meeting. There's already talk about reviewing our bear management procedures." "It wasn't a failure of procedure," Scott insisted, wincing as he tried to shift position in the hospital bed. "I followed protocol. Sometimes nature just throws curveballs." "No one's saying otherwise," Linda assured him, "but any incident, this serious triggers a review. It's standard." A nurse entered to check Scott's IV and inform them that visiting hours would be ending soon. Mike stood, placing a supportive hand briefly on Scott's shoulder. "Get some rest. We'll handle things at the park. Focus on healing." After his colleagues had left, Scott was left alone with his thoughts and the rhythmic beeping of the hospital monitors. The events of the morning replayed in his mind. The sudden appearance of the cubs, the shifting wind, the terrifying charge of Bear 457. Despite the trauma of the attack, he found himself hoping that the incident wouldn't result in drastic measures against the bear. In his 15 years as a ranger, he had developed a deep respect for the wildlife under his protection, understanding that even dangerous encounters were usually the result of natural behaviors rather than malice. The night passed slowly, with nurses coming regularly to check his vital signs and administer medication. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by pain when the medication began to wear off and by the constant activity of a busy hospital. By morning, Scott felt exhausted, despite having been in bed for hours. Breakfast arrived on a hospital tray, bland oatmeal, toast and orange juice that Scott picked at without much appetite. As he was attempting to find a comfortable position that didn't aggravate his injuries, a knock at the door preceded the entrance of a man Scott didn't recognize. The visitor wore a button-down shirt with the emblem of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service embroidered on the pocket. "Ranger Davis, I'm Agent Carlos Mendez with Fish and Wildlife. Hope I'm not interrupting your breakfast." Scott gestured to the barely touched food. "Not really eating much anyway. What can I do for you, Agent Mendez?" The man pulled up the chair Mike had used the previous evening and sat, placing a tablet on his lap. "I've been assigned to follow up on yesterday's incident. I've reviewed the preliminary report filed by Ranger Sullivan, but I was hoping to get some direct information from you about the bear's behavior." Scott nodded, unsurprised by the visit. Fish and wildlife involvement was standard procedure for serious bear-human incidents, particularly those resulting in injury. The agency was responsible for making recommendations about wildlife management across federal lands, including potential decisions about problematic individual animals. "I'm happy to help, though I already gave a pretty detailed account to my colleagues." "I understand," Mendez said with a professional smile, "but there are some specific aspects of the encounter that I'd like to clarify. Do you mind if I record our conversation?" For the second time in less than 24 hours, Scott found himself recounting the details of the attack. Agent Mendez asked pointed questions about 457's behavior, whether she had shown any signs of habituation to humans, if her charge had been immediate or preceded by warning behaviors, how she had responded to the bear spray, and her actions after the attack. "From what you're describing," Mendez said after Scott had finished, "this appears to be a classic defensive attack motivated by protection of cubs. The bear didn't pursue once the perceived threat to her young was removed, and she showed appropriate warning behaviors before charging." "That's my assessment as well," Scott agreed. 457 has a history of food-seeking behavior in campsites, but no prior aggression toward humans that I'm aware of. Yesterday was entirely about cub protection." Mendez made some notes on his tablet. "The park's wildlife management team has provided her tracking data from the past year. There have been 17 reported sightings in developed areas, which is higher than average, but not unprecedented for bears in Yosemite. The question now is what management actions, if any, should be taken." Scott tensed slightly, knowing what management actions could potentially mean. In severe cases, bears that attacked humans could be euthanized, though this was typically reserved for predatory attacks rather than defensive ones. More commonly, problem bears might be relocated, though studies had shown this was often ineffective. Has bears frequently returned to their original territories? "In my professional opinion," Scott said carefully, "no direct action against 457 is warranted. This was a natural defensive response to a perceived threat to her cubs. The appropriate measure would be temporary closure of that section of the park until she naturally moves her family to a different area, which black bears typically do every few weeks as food sources shift." Mendez nodded, seeming neither to agree nor disagree. "I appreciate your input, Ranger Davis. Especially given that you were the one injured, your perspective carries particular weight. I'll include your recommendation in my report." The agent asked a few more technical questions about the specific location of the encounter and the proximity to designated trails and campsites before concluding the interview. As he was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing, Ranger Davis. There's likely to be media interest in this incident. Bear attacks always generate headlines. Do you have any comment you'd like included if I'm approached by press? Scott considered this for a moment. Just that this encounter, while unfortunate, was the result of me accidentally coming between a mother and her cubs, a situation any wild animal would respond to defensively. It's a reminder that we're visitors in their habitat, and maintaining appropriate distance is crucial for both human safety and wildlife welfare. Well said, Mendez replied with a nod of approval. Focus on your recovery, Ranger. We'll handle the wildlife management aspects. After the agent's departure, Scott's morning continued with medical rounds. Dr. Rodriguez arrived with 2 residents, removing the bandages to inspect his wounds. The leg lacerations, now closed with neat lines of sutures, looked painful, but showed no signs of infection. The bite marks on his side were more visibly bruised, the skin around them turning spectacular shades of purple and yellow. Everything looks good so far, Dr. Rodriguez announced after the examination. No signs of infection, and the wound edges are approximating nicely. We'll continue IV antibiotics for another 48 hours as a precaution. How's your pain level today? Manageable, Scott replied, though the throbbing in his leg intensified whenever the pain medication began to wear off. I'd like to try getting up today if possible. We can arrange that this afternoon with physical therapy, the doctor agreed. Very limited movement, just to prevent complications from prolonged bed rest. But I should warn you that first vertical position after this kind of trauma can be challenging. Your body has been through significant stress. After the medical team left, Scott found himself alone again, with little to do but reflect on the incident and its potential repercussions. The television mounted on the wall offered little distraction, daytime programming held no appeal, and the local news had already picked up the story of the bear attack, presenting it with the typical sensationalism that made Scott wince. Yosemite, Ranger in terrifying bear attack, read the headline crawling across the bottom of the screen as a reporter stood at the entrance to the national park. The young woman, her expression appropriately grave, was mid-sentence. Officials confirmed that an experienced park ranger was seriously injured yesterday morning in what they're describing as a defensive attack by a mother black bear. The ranger, whose name has not been released, reportedly came between the bear and her cubs during a routine patrol. Scott muted the television, frustrated by the framing of the incident. Despite the reporter's use of the term defensive attack, the dramatic language and ominous background music painted the encounter as something far more sinister than the natural protective behavior it had been. This kind of reporting often fueled misconceptions about wildlife, particularly predators like bears, contributing to unnecessary fear that sometimes led to calls for culling or other extreme management measures. His musing was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, it was Samantha Chen, still in uniform and carrying a small duffel bag. "Thought you might want some of your own things," she explained, setting the bag on the foot of the bed. "I stopped by your cabin this morning, packed some clothes, your phone charger, that book I saw on your nightstand." "Thanks, Sam," Scott said gratefully. Hospital gowns aren't exactly comfortable attire. Samantha pulled up the visitor's chair. Unlike Mike and Linda the previous evening, she seemed less focused on the official aspects of the incident and more concerned about Scott himself. "How are you really doing?" she asked. "And I don't mean the physical injuries." Scott appreciated the question. Samantha was one of the newer rangers, having joined the Yosemite team just 3 years ago after transferring from Olympic National Park in Washington. Despite the difference in their experience levels, they had quickly developed a good working relationship based on shared conservation values. "Honestly, I keep replaying it, wondering if I could have prevented it," Scott admitted. "If I'd checked the wind direction more carefully or taken a different route around the clearing." "That's normal after any traumatic event," Samantha said. "But from what I heard over the radio and what we saw when we arrived, you followed protocol. Sometimes our job puts us in proximity to wildlife, and occasionally that proximity turns dangerous. It's an occupational hazard we all accept." Scott nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words but still feeling the weight of the incident. "Any update from the park? How's the superintendent handling it?" "There was an all-staff meeting this morning," Samantha reported. Superintendent Blackwell reviewed the incident and announced a temporary expansion of the closed area around where 457 and her cubs were last tracked. They've also accelerated the timeline for installing additional bear-proof food storage at the backcountry campsites. "That's a reasonable response," Scott said, relieved that the focus seemed to be on preventative measures rather than direct action against the bear. There's one other thing, Samantha added, her expression suggesting she wasn't sure how Scott would receive the news. Blackwell wants to use this incident as a catalyst for updating our bear encounter training. He's asked if you'd be willing to help develop new materials once you're recovered, first-hand account, lessons learned, that sort of thing. Scott considered this for a moment. Turning his traumatic experience into a teaching tool wasn't something he had contemplated, but it made sense. Actual bear attacks were rare enough that few rangers had direct experience with them, yet the potential was always present in parks like Yosemite with significant bear populations. I'd be willing to do that, he decided. If it helps prevent similar incidents or improves response when they do occur, that's worthwhile. Samantha smiled, clearly relieved by his reaction. Good. I told Blackwell you'd probably be on board. Oh, and there's been a development with the media situation. The Public Affairs Office has been fielding calls all morning from various news outlets. They're requesting interviews, photos, the works. Scott groaned. The public aspects of ranger work had never been his favorite part of the job. He preferred the quiet patrols, the conservation work, the direct interaction with visitors who genuinely wanted to learn about the park's ecosystem. Media attention felt invasive, particularly when he was confined to a hospital bed. What's the official response been so far? Standard procedure, confirmation of the incident with minimal details, emphasis on the defensive nature of the encounter, reminder about proper behavior in bear country. But they're pressing for more, especially now that one of the visitors near Lower Pines apparently captured video of you being carried out of the woods on a stretcher. It's already circulating online. Scott closed his eyes briefly, imagining the footage. Wonderful. Just what I needed. Public Affairs is suggesting a controlled response might be better than no response, Samantha continued. They're thinking a short written statement from you, focused on educational aspects rather than the sensational details. No on-camera interviews until you're ready, if ever. I can work with that, Scott agreed reluctantly. Draft something emphasizing proper food storage, maintaining safe distances from wildlife, understanding natural behaviors. I'll review it before it goes out. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, park gossip, the unusually high visitor numbers for early spring, Samantha's recent spotting of a Sierra Nevada red fox, one of the rarest mammals in the park. The normalcy of ranger shop talk provided a welcome distraction from Scott's circumstances. When Samantha eventually left to return to her duties, Scott found himself in better spirits despite the physical discomfort. The conversation had helped frame the incident in its proper context, a rare but inherent risk of working in close proximity to wildlife rather than a catastrophic failure or freak occurrence. The afternoon proceeded with Scott's first session with the physical therapist, a burly man named Greg who helped him slowly maneuver from the bed to a standing position. The doctor's warning proved accurate. The change in posture sent waves of dizziness and pain through Scott's body, and his injured leg trembled under even the minimal weight he placed on it. But after a few minutes of carefully controlled breathing, he managed to take 3 small steps with the aid of a walker before the effort became too much. That's excellent for day 1, Greg encouraged him as they worked their way back to the bed. Tomorrow we'll try for 5 steps. By the time you're discharged, we want you mobile enough to navigate your home environment with crutches or a cane. The small achievement, though far from his usual capabilities, gave Scott a tangible sense of progress. Recovery would be measured in these incremental improvements, a few more steps each day, gradually decreasing pain levels, wounds slowly knitting themselves back together. As evening approached, Scott received one more visitor, Superintendent Marcus Blackwell himself. The park's highest-ranking official rarely left his administrative duties to make personal visits, so his arrival signified the seriousness with which the National Park Service was treating the incident. "Davis," Blackwell greeted him with a firm handshake. "You're looking better than I expected." "Thank you, sir," Scott replied, automatically straightening his posture despite the pain it caused. Blackwell had a military background before joining the Park Service, and his commanding presence tended to inspire formality, even in casual settings. The superintendent took the visitor's chair, his expression grave. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports and spoken with Agent Mendez from Fish and Wildlife. I wanted to personally inform you of the management decisions regarding Bear 457 before they become official." Scott tensed, preparing himself for unwelcome news. Despite the defensive nature of the attack, there was always the possibility that administrative concerns about liability or public perception would drive more severe management actions. After consulting with wildlife biologists, park management and Fish and Wildlife, we've determined that no direct action against the bear is warranted at this time. Blackwell announced. The encounter has been classified as a defensive response to perceived threat to offspring, which is consistent with natural behavior patterns. We'll maintain the expanded closure area for at least 2 weeks and increase ranger patrols along the perimeter. But 457 and her cubs will remain within the park ecosystem. Relief washed over Scott. Thank you, sir. I believe that's the right decision. Your input was a significant factor, Blackwell acknowledged. Both Mendez and Sullivan emphasized your assessment that this was neither predatory behavior nor the result of habituation to humans. Your professional judgment, especially given that you were the injured party, carried considerable weight. The superintendent shifted slightly, his expression becoming more focused. Now, regarding your recovery and return to duty, I understand from your doctor that we're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks before you could potentially resume even limited responsibilities. That's my understanding as well, Scott confirmed, though I'm hoping to beat that timeline. Blackwell nodded, unsurprised by the response. Your dedication is noted, but full recovery is the priority. When you are cleared to return, I'd like you to consider a temporary reassignment. Sir? Scott questioned, uncertain what the superintendent was suggesting. Ranger Chen may have mentioned our interest in developing enhanced bear encounter training materials. What she probably didn't convey is the scope of what I have in mind. This incident highlights a gap in our preparedness. Our theoretical protocols are sound, but practical application under stress conditions is something we can improve. Scott waited, sensing there was more to the proposal. I'd like you to lead the development of a comprehensive bear awareness and response program, Blackwell continued, not just for Yosemite, but potentially as a model for all national parks with bear populations. Your experience both before and during this incident makes you uniquely qualified. You'd work with wildlife biologists, our education team, and safety officers to create something that integrates the latest research with practical field experience. The proposal caught Scott by surprise. His current role was primarily operational, patrolling, visitor assistance, enforcement of park regulations. The development of a training program would represent a significant shift toward the educational and policy aspects of park management. I appreciate the confidence, sir, Scott said carefully, but I've always been a field ranger. My strength is in the practical application, not program development, which is precisely why you're the right person for this, Blackwell countered. We have plenty of academic experts who understand bear behavior in theory. What we need is someone who can translate that knowledge into practical training that will stick with rangers in high-stress situations. Your experience on Tuesday proves you know what works and what doesn't when theory meets reality. Scott considered the proposal. There was merit to the superintendent's argument, and the opportunity to potentially improve safety practices across the national park system was appealing. Still, the thought of being removed from his regular patrol duties even temporarily gave him pause. How long would this reassignment last? He asked. Initial development would take approximately 3 months, Blackwell explained. After that, we'd evaluate the program's effectiveness and decide on next steps. You'd still be based here at Yosemite, and the role would include some limited fieldwork for practical demonstrations once you're medically cleared. I'd like some time to think about it, Scott requested. This is quite different from my current responsibilities. Blackwell stood, seeming satisfied with the response. Of course, focus on your recovery first. We can discuss the details once you're discharged and have had time to process everything. For now, I'll have Public Affairs send over a draft statement for your review regarding the media requests. After the superintendent left, Scott found himself contemplating the proposed reassignment. Throughout his career, he had defined himself primarily as a field ranger, someone who worked directly with the land and wildlife rather than behind a desk. The thought of stepping away from that, even temporarily, created a sense of disconnection from the identity he had built over 15 years. But there was also an opportunity here. If his experience could help other rangers better prepare for wildlife encounters, potentially preventing injuries or improving responses when incidents did occur, wasn't that a worthwhile pursuit? And the program development wouldn't be permanent. After the initial phase, he could likely return to his regular duties with new perspectives and insights. The evening news again featured the story of the bear attack, though this time with slightly more nuanced coverage. The park's official statement had apparently been released, emphasizing the defensive nature of the encounter and using it as an educational opportunity to remind visitors about proper behavior in bear country. Scott's name was still being withheld. at this point identified only as an experienced ranger who had accidentally come between a mother bear and her cubs during a routine patrol. As night fell over the hospital, Scott found his thoughts continually returning to the moment of the attack. The sudden appearance of Bear 457 charging through the underbrush, the split-second decisions he had made, the overwhelming force of the impact when the bear struck him. Despite his injuries and the trauma of the experience, he found no anger toward the animal. 457 had acted according to her nature, protecting her young from a perceived threat. If anything, the encounter reinforced Scott's respect for these powerful creatures and the wildness they represented. The second day in the hospital passed more smoothly than the first. Scott's pain levels were more manageable, and the medical team was pleased with his progress. The antibiotics appeared to be preventing any infection in his wounds, and his second physical therapy session showed modest improvement, 6 steps instead of 3, with slightly better stability. Linda Sullivan visited again, this time with official paperwork for Scott's incident report and workers' compensation claim. The bureaucratic aspects of the attack required detailed documentation, from the exact location and time to specific descriptions of the bear's behavior and the circumstances leading to the encounter. Fish and Wildlife has officially classified it as a defensive attack, Linda informed him as they worked through the forms. Their recommendation supports our decision to maintain current management practices with increased monitoring rather than intervention. That's good news, Scott said, signing where indicated on the forms. Any update on 457's movements? She's still in the closed section, about 2 miles north of where the encounter occurred. Wildlife Management has visual confirmation of both cubs still with her. They seem to be settling into a normal routine. Scott nodded, relieved to hear that the bear family was behaving typically following the incident. Often, major encounters with humans could disrupt natural behaviors, sometimes leading to abandonment of territory or separation of mothers from their young. The fact that 4157 had resumed normal activities suggested the encounter had not created lasting behavioral issues. "Oh, I almost forgot," Linda added, reaching into her bag. "Public Affairs sent over their draft statement for your review. They're hoping to release something with your name attached by tomorrow morning to get ahead of the more sensationalized coverage." Scott reviewed the single-page document. The draft was straightforward and educational in tone, focusing on the defensive nature of the encounter and using it as a platform to remind the public about proper behavior in bear country. His personal comments, clearly crafted by the public affairs team but presented as direct quotes, emphasized respect for wildlife and understanding of natural behaviors. "This looks fine," he said, handing it back with a small amendment to the paragraph about bear spray effectiveness. "Add that even properly deployed deterrents aren't guaranteed to stop a defensive attack from a mother bear. People should never rely solely on bear spray. Distance is always the primary safety measure." Linda made the note and tucked the statement away. "I'll forward your approval. They're requesting a photo as well if you're comfortable with that. Nothing current," she added quickly, seeing Scott's expression. "Just your official ranger portrait from the website. They think putting a face to the story helps humanize it and makes the educational message more impactful." Scott reluctantly agreed. His official portrait was already public on the park's website anyway, and if it helped convey the message about wildlife safety, he could accept the additional attention. The evening brought a surprise visitor, Scott's younger brother Daniel, who had driven over 3 hours from his home in Sacramento upon hearing about the attack. Unlike the official visits from colleagues and supervisors, Daniel's presence allowed Scott to process the emotional aspects of the experience more openly. "Jesus, Scott," Daniel said, after seeing the extent of the bandages. "When Mom called and said you'd been attacked by a bear, I thought she was exaggerating. But you really did get mauled." "It looks worse than it is," Scott assured him, though that wasn't entirely true. "The doctors say there's no permanent damage. I'll be back on the trails before you know it." Daniel shook his head. "Always the tough ranger. You know, most people would take this as a sign to consider a career change, maybe something that doesn't involve wild animals trying to kill you." Scott smiled faintly. This was an old conversation between them. Daniel had never understood his brother's devotion to rangering, particularly the wilderness protection aspects that sometimes involved risk. As a software engineer working in the comfort of an air-conditioned office, Daniel viewed Scott's career choice as unnecessarily dangerous and poorly compensated. "The bear wasn't trying to kill me," Scott explained patiently. "She was protecting her cubs. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Doesn't matter what she was trying to do," Daniel countered. "Results the same. You're in a hospital bed looking like you went through a meat grinder. 15 years. You've been doing this job, and what do you have to show for it? A cabin you don't own on park property, a salary that hasn't kept pace with inflation, and now a collection of scars. Rather than argue, Scott redirected the conversation. How are Lisa and the kids, he asked, referring to his brother's wife and 2 young daughters. The strategy worked, and Daniel launched into updates about his family, his older daughters' recent science fair victory, his younger daughter's emerging talent for soccer, his wife's promotion at the accounting firm where she worked. Scott listened with genuine interest, appreciating this window into a very different life than his own. As visiting hours drew to a close, Daniel's expression grew more serious. Lisa wanted me to extend an invitation. When you're discharged, come stay with us for a while during your recovery. The guest room is yours as long as you need it, and the girls would love to have their uncle around. The offer was generous and clearly well-intentioned, but Scott knew immediately it wasn't right for him. I appreciate that, really, but I need to be near the park during recovery. There's follow-up with the incident investigation, and I might be developing a new training program once I'm mobile enough. Daniel seemed unsurprised by the refusal. Figured you'd say that. Just know the offer stands if you change your mind. Sacramento's a lot more comfortable than that rustic cabin of yours, especially when you're trying to navigate on crutches. After his brother left, Scott reflected on the different paths their lives had taken. Daniel had always craved stability and comfort, building a successful career in technology and establishing a traditional family life in the suburbs. Scott had chosen a different direction, drawn to the wildness and unpredictability of nature, finding fulfillment in work that connected him to the land in fundamental ways. Neither path was superior, just profoundly different expressions of what made a life meaningful. The third day in the hospital brought news that Scott was being discharged. Dr. Rodriguez was satisfied with his progress and confident that the high risk of infection had been minimized by the aggressive antibiotic treatment. After a final examination and removal of the drainage tubes from his leg wounds, she provided detailed instructions for home care. The sutures will remain in place for at least 10 days, she explained, changing the dressings one final time before discharge. You'll need to keep the wounds clean and dry, changing bandages daily and watching for any signs of infection, increased redness, warmth, swelling, or discharge. I've prescribed oral antibiotics for another 7 days, along with pain medication, to be used as needed. Scott listened carefully, knowing that proper wound care would be crucial to his recovery, particularly given the nature of bear attack injuries. The doctor also arranged for follow-up appointments with both her office and the physical therapist, setting a schedule for the next several weeks of his recovery. By early afternoon, Scott was seated in a wheelchair at the hospital entrance, waiting for his ride back to Yosemite. Linda had arranged for a park service vehicle to transport him to his cabin, where arrangements had been made for his initial care. The administrative staff had coordinated meal delivery from the park's employee dining facility for the first week, and a rotating schedule of off-duty rangers had volunteered to check in on him regularly until he was more mobile. The ride back to the park was uncomfortable despite the driver's efforts to avoid bumps and potholes. Every jolt sent pain through Scott's injured leg and side, reminding him of how far he still had to go in his recovery. Yet as they passed through the entrance gate to Yosemite, he felt a profound sense of homecoming. The familiar landscape of towering granite cliffs, meadows just beginning to green with spring growth, and the winding ribbon of the Merced River flowing through the valley floor restored something essential that the sterile hospital environment had temporarily taken from him. The Park Service cabin that had been Scott's home for the past decade was a modest structure. 1 bedroom, a small living area with a kitchenette, and a bathroom with a shower that sometimes ran out of hot water. But its location, set slightly, apart from the main employee housing area and backed by a stand of ponderosa pines, made it special. From his small porch, Scott could watch deer grazing in the early morning and listen to the great horned owls calling after sunset. Mike Two Feathers was waiting when they arrived, having volunteered to help Scott get settled during the first crucial hours of his return home. With Mike's assistance, Scott managed the 4 steps up to his porch and through the front door, leaning heavily on the crutches the hospital had provided. "Home sweet home," Mike said, steadying Scott as he made his way to the well-worn armchair that served as the cabin's primary seating. "Linda stocked your fridge and pantry yesterday. You've got enough food to last a siege." "Thanks for the help," Scott said, grateful to be sitting again after the exertion of the short walk from the vehicle. "I didn't realize how exhausting a few steps could be." "So that's normal," Mike assured him, setting the bag of medications and wound care supplies on the small kitchen counter. "Remember my broken leg after that rock slide on the 4-mile trail 3 years ago? First day home, I made it from the door to the couch and slept for 12 hours straight." The two rangers chatted while Mike prepared a simple meal and arranged the cabin for maximum accessibility during Scott's limited mobility. Having been through his own serious injury and recovery, Mike understood the practical challenges better than most. He moved furniture to create clear paths, placed frequently needed items within easy reach, and set up a temporary bed in the living room so Scott wouldn't have to navigate to the bedroom during the initial recovery period. When Mike eventually left, promising to return the following morning to help with the first wound care routine, Scott found himself alone for the first time since the attack. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional call of a Stella's jay from the pines outside and the distant sound of a park shuttle bus on the main road. After the constant activity and noise of the hospital, the solitude was both welcome and slightly disorienting. He reached for his personal phone, which Daniel had charged for him at the hospital, and found numerous text messages and missed calls from friends, family, and colleagues who had heard about the incident. News had spread quickly through both official channels and the Ranger grapevine. Scott began the laborious process of responding to each message, assuring everyone that he was recovering well and no, the bear had not been euthanized, as some rumors apparently suggested. As evening approached, Scott managed to maneuver himself to the cabin's small porch, where he could watch the lengthening shadows creep across the valley floor. From this vantage point, he could see the top of Half Dome catching the last golden rays of the setting sun, a sight that never failed to inspire a sense of reverence for the natural world. The events of the past 3 days had been traumatic, certainly. The physical pain and the long recovery ahead were unwelcome disruptions to his life and work. Yet sitting there on his porch, watching the light change over the landscape he had dedicated his career to protecting, Scott found himself reflecting on the encounter with Bear 457 from a different perspective. The attack had not been an aberration or a failure. It was a reminder of the fundamentally wild nature of the place he called home. Yosemite, despite the roads and campgrounds and visitor centers, remained at its core a wilderness where natural processes unfolded according to ancient patterns. The mother bear, protecting her cubs, was acting on instincts shaped over millennia, instincts essential to the survival of her species. Scott's phone buzzed with an incoming email, the Public Affairs Office sending the final version of his statement that had been released to the media that afternoon. He scanned it quickly, finding the message largely unchanged from the draft he had approved. The accompanying photo showed him in his ranger hat and uniform, looking serious but approachable, taken the previous summer during an educational program about wildlife safety. A quick internet search showed that the statement was already being picked up by local news outlets and some national conservation websites. Most were handling it responsibly, emphasizing the educational aspects rather than sensationalizing the attack itself. A few comment sections revealed the expected range of public reactions, some expressing sympathy for his injuries, others questioning why the bear hadn't been euthanized, and still others using the incident as a platform for broader debates about wildlife management and human encroachment on natural habitats. Scott closed the browser, deciding that monitoring the public response to his statement wouldn't contribute positively to his recovery. Instead, he returned his attention to the landscape before him, now fading into twilight as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The next morning brought the first of what would become his daily routine during recovery. Mike arrived, as promised, to help with the initial home wound care, a process that proved more awkward and painful than Scott had anticipated, despite the detailed instructions from Dr. Rodriguez. The leg wounds in particular required careful cleaning and redressing, with special attention to ensuring the drainage sites remained unobstructed. "Looking good," Mike commented as they finished applying fresh bandages. "No signs of infection that I can see. You got lucky. Bear mouths carry all sorts of bacteria that can cause nasty infections." "Don't feel particularly lucky at the moment," Scott grimaced, the wound care having aggravated the pain that the morning's medication had somewhat dulled. "Trust me, you are," Mike insisted. "I've seen bear attack injuries that got infected despite hospital treatment. One guy in Glacier lost most of his calf muscle to necrotizing fasciitis after a relatively minor bear bite. You're healing clean so far." The remainder of the day established the pattern that would define Scott's recovery period. Physical therapy exercises to maintain muscle tone and prevent stiffness, periods of elevated leg positioning to reduce swelling, careful monitoring of pain levels to balance, medication use with necessary discomfort that signaled limits he shouldn't push. The regular rhythm of wound care, medication, exercise, and rest provided structure to days that might otherwise have blurred together in his isolated cabin. By the end of the first week home, Scott had progressed to moving around the cabin with a single crutch rather than two, though venturing outside still required more support. His colleagues continued their rotation of daily visits, bringing not just practical assistance, but also updates from the park that kept him connected to the world beyond his recovery. Samantha Chen arrived on the 8th day after his discharge, bringing both lunch from the employee dining hall and news about Bear 457. "She's moved her cubs," Samantha reported as they ate at Scott's small kitchen table. Wildlife management tracked them heading toward the higher elevations east of where the encounter occurred. They've lifted the closure order on the western section near Lower Pines, though there's still an advisory in effect. "Moving with the food sources," Scott noted. "Berry patches are starting to produce at the middle elevations this time of year. She's following natural patterns, which is a good sign that the encounter didn't significantly disrupt her behavior." Samantha nodded, pleased with his interpretation. "That's exactly what the biologist said. They're considering it a successful management outcome. Natural behavior resumed, no negative conditioning created for either the bear or visitors. Oh, and Blackwell asked me to give you this." She handed over a folder containing a more formal outline of the training program proposal the superintendent had discussed at the hospital. The document detailed a comprehensive approach to bear encounter training, with modules covering behavioral recognition, appropriate response techniques, deterrent usage, and post-encounter procedures. A proposed timeline suggested development throughout the summer months, with a pilot implementation for new seasonal rangers in the fall. "He's serious about this," Scott observed, flipping through the detailed proposal. "Very," Samantha confirmed. "This is being positioned as a model program that could be adapted for use throughout the national park system. If it's successful here, it could influence bear management practices across the country." The scope of the project was both intimidating and appealing. Scott had always approached his ranger duties with a commitment to education and conservation, but this represented an opportunity to shape policy and training on a much broader scale than his daily patrols and visitor interactions allowed. "I'm still considering it," he told Samantha, closing the folder. "Part of me wants to just get back to normal duties once I'm cleared, but another part sees the value in this." "For what it's worth," Samantha offered, "I think you'd be excellent at developing this training. You have the field experience to make it practical, not just theoretical. And after experiencing an actual attack, you can speak to aspects of bear encounters that most rangers thankfully never have to learn firsthand." The conversation shifted to other park news. A rock fall on El Capitan that had temporarily closed one climbing route, the early arrival of seasonal employees for the summer rush, the ongoing challenge of managing the increasing visitor numbers without degrading the natural resources they came to experience. These discussions helped Scott maintain his connection to the park community, despite his physical isolation during recovery. As the second week of his recovery progressed, Scott began venturing beyond his cabin for short, therapeutic walks. Using a walking stick fashioned from a fallen oak branch as additional support beyond his medical crutch, he established a daily routine of morning and evening circuits that gradually increased in distance. The first attempts were humbling, barely. 100 yards left him winded and in considerable pain, the muscles around his injuries protesting even this modest exertion. But with consistent effort, each day saw slight improvements. 200 yards became a quarter mile, then a half mile over the course of 10 days. The rhythm of walking, even at his reduced pace, restored something essential to Scott's sense of self. Rangers were meant to move through the landscape, to maintain that physical connection with the land they stewarded. Being confined indoors had taken a greater psychological toll than he had initially recognized. On the morning marking 3 weeks since the attack, Scott received a visit from Agent Mendez of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The agent arrived, unannounced, his government SUV pulling up beside Scott's cabin as the ranger was returning from his morning walk. "Ranger Davis," Mendez greeted him, emerging from the vehicle. "Good to see you up and moving. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Scott nodded, gesturing toward the porch chairs. "Just finished my daily constitutional, doctor's orders to keep mobile." They settled on the porch, and Mendez pulled out a tablet, similar to the one he had used during their hospital interview. "I wanted to personally deliver the final determination regarding Bear 457. The official report has been submitted to the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior. Scott straightened slightly, his attention focused. Despite the regular updates from his colleagues about the bear's movements, the official determination could potentially override the park's current management approach if Fish and Wildlife deemed it necessary. The service has classified the encounter as a non-predatory defensive attack triggered by maternal protection instincts, Mendez announced. Given the bear's subsequent return to natural behavioral patterns and movement away from high-use visitor areas, our recommendation is for continued monitoring without direct intervention. Normal protocols for management of the area can resume with standard advisories about bear activity. Relief washed over Scott. That's the right call, thank you. Mendez nodded, seeming personally satisfied with the outcome as well. Your input was valuable in this determination. It's not often we have a victim of an attack advocate for the animal, but your professional assessment of 457's behavior was consistent with our biologist's evaluations. She was doing what bears do, Scott said simply, protecting her young. Is natural behavior, not aggression in the problematic sense. Exactly, Mendez agreed, and that's what I wanted to discuss with you beyond the official determination. Your perspective on this incident has been noted at higher levels within the service. We've been developing updated guidelines for wildlife encounter assessment, particularly for predator species in national parks and wilderness areas. Your experience and professional insights could be valuable to that process. Scott raised an eyebrow. In what capacity? Initially as a consultant, Mendez explained, reviewing draft guidelines, providing input on the practical application of theoretical protocols, possibly participating in training seminars for wildlife management personnel. Superintendent Blackwell mentioned you're considering a role in developing enhanced bear encounter training here at Yosemite. What we're suggesting would complement that effort. The proposal represented yet another expansion of the potential impact of Scott's experience, from improving protocols at Yosemite to potentially influencing wildlife management practices at a national level. It was far from the fieldwork that had defined his ranger career, but perhaps that evolution was not entirely unwelcome. I'm open to the possibility, Scott told Mendez. Let me see how the Yosemite program development goes first. If that's successful, I'd be willing to discuss broader consultation. Mendez seemed pleased with this response. That's all we're asking at this point. I'll make note of your interest and be in touch once the new guidelines reach the review stage. As the agent prepared to leave, Scott found himself reflecting on how the trajectory of his career might have been permanently altered by those few minutes in the North Woods. The encounter with Bear 457, traumatic as it had been, was opening doors to aspects of conservation work he had never seriously considered. There was a certain irony in the fact that an incident that had temporarily removed him from the field might ultimately allow him to have broader influence on how rangers and other wildlife professionals approached their work. The following day brought Scott's first return to park headquarters since the attack. Linda Sullivan arrived at his cabin in the morning to drive him to his scheduled meeting with Superintendent Blackwell. The short journey marked Scott's first venture beyond walking distance of his cabin, and he found himself studying the familiar landscape of Yosemite Valley with renewed appreciation as they drove. The administration building housed the offices of the park's management team as well as the coordination center for ranger operations. As Linda assisted Scott from the vehicle, he noticed several colleagues watching from windows or pausing in their duties to observe his arrival. News of his scheduled visit had evidently spread, and his return to headquarters, even in this limited capacity, was something of an event. Inside, rangers and administrative staff greeted him warmly, many expressing relief at seeing him mobile and recovering. Scott was touched by the genuine concern and support, though somewhat uncomfortable with being the center of attention. He had always preferred to focus on the park rather than himself, viewing his role as facilitating others' connections with the natural world rather than drawing attention to his own experiences. Superintendent Blackwell was waiting in his office, rising to greet Scott with a careful handshake that acknowledged his still healing injuries. The office reflected Blackwell's military background and administrative focus, meticulously organized, decorated primarily with maps of the park and framed recognitions from the Department of the Interior. A large topographical model of Yosemite Valley dominated one corner, used for planning emergency responses and resource management strategies. "Take a seat, Davis," Blackwell offered, gesturing to a comfortable chair positioned for easier access than the standard visitor seating. "You're looking significantly better than when I saw you in the hospital." "Feeling better too, sir," Scott confirmed, easing himself into the chair with the assistance of his crutch. Still a ways to go, but making progress. The superintendent nodded approvingly before getting directly to the purpose of the meeting. I've reviewed your medical updates and the projected recovery timeline. Dr. Rodriguez estimates another 3 to 4 weeks before you might be cleared for limited duty, with full field capabilities possibly resuming in 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications. That's consistent with my understanding, Scott agreed. I'm hoping to beat those projections, but the leg wounds are healing slowly. No need to rush, Blackwell cautioned, which brings me to the main topic, your role during and after recovery. Have you had time to consider the training program proposal I sent over? Scott had indeed spent considerable time reviewing the detailed proposal, weighing it against his preference for returning to his standard field duties as soon as medically possible. The decision wasn't straightforward. There was comfort in the familiar routine of patrols, visitor interaction, and direct resource management. Yet the training program offered a different kind of contribution, one that might have more lasting impact across the National Park Service. I have, Scott, confirmed, and I'm willing to take it on, with one condition. Blackwell raised an eyebrow, which is that once the program is developed and the initial implementation is complete, I return to field duties as my primary assignment. I'm willing to continue, supporting the training as needed, but I don't want to transition permanently to an administrative or educational role. The superintendent considered this for a moment before nodding. That's reasonable. We need your field expertise for this project, but I understand the importance of getting back to your regular duties. We can structure this as a temporary special assignment with a defined end date, after which you return to your standard position with perhaps some ongoing advisory involvement in the training program. With that understanding established, they moved into the specifics of the project. Blackwell had already assembled a team that would work with Scott, a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior, an educational program developer from the Parks Interpretation Division, and a safety officer with experience in protocol development. Scott would serve as the practical field expert and project lead, ensuring that the resulting training materials reflected real-world scenarios and applicable techniques rather than purely theoretical approaches. The timing actually works well with your recovery, Blackwell noted. The initial development phase can be done largely from your cabin or here at headquarters while you're on limited duty. By the time we're ready for field demonstrations and practical testing, you should be medically cleared for those activities. The Kaini meeting concluded with a tentative timeline and the scheduling of an initial team meeting for the following week. As Scott prepared to leave, leaning more heavily on his crutch than when he had arrived due to fatigue, Blackwell offered one final observation. This incident could have been career-ending, Davis. The fact that you're turning it into an opportunity to improve our practices speaks to why you've been an asset to this park for 15 years. Not everyone would respond this way. The superintendent's words stayed with Scott during the drive back to his cabin. The attack had indeed been a pivotal moment, one that could have pushed him away from the work he loved if he had allowed fear or resentment to take root. Instead, it had paradoxically deepened his connection to the mission of the National Park Service, to conserve natural and cultural resources for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of current and future generations. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Scott's days. Mornings began with his increasingly ambitious walks, now extending to nearly a mile as his strength returned. Late mornings and afternoons were dedicated to the training program development, with team members often visiting his cabin for working sessions rather than requiring him to travel to headquarters. Evenings were for rest and reflection, often spent on his porch watching the changing light on Yosemite's iconic granite formations. The work itself proved more engaging than Scott had initially anticipated. His years of field experience provided invaluable insights into how theoretical knowledge translated into practical application in the unpredictable conditions of wilderness encounters. The wildlife biologist Dr. Elaine Wong brought the latest research on bear behavior and deterrent effectiveness, while education specialist Tom Matthews helped structure the information into teachable modules that would resonate with rangers of varying experience levels. What we're missing, Scott observed during one particularly productive session 6 weeks into the project, is the emotional reality of these encounters. The protocols look straightforward on paper, but in the moment, with a bear charging or showing stress behaviors, the physiological response can override training if it's not deeply ingrained. This insight led to the development of what would become one of the most innovative aspects of the program, stress response training. that simulated the cognitive effects of wildlife encounters. Using techniques adapted from law enforcement and military training, they designed exercises that introduced controlled stress elements while requiring rangers to execute proper protocols, building muscle memory and decision-making pathways that would remain accessible even under duress. As Scott's medical recovery progressed, he was gradually cleared for more activities. The sutures had long since been removed, leaving pink scars on his leg that would eventually fade to white but never disappear completely. The bite wounds on his side had healed more quickly, leaving less visible marks, but occasional twinges when he moved certain ways. Physical therapy continued, transitioning from basic mobility to strength rebuilding and eventually to the more demanding movements his ranger duties would require. 10 weeks after the attack, Dr. Rodriguez cleared Scott for limited field duty, no solo backcountry patrols yet, but he could resume visitor center responsibilities, short trail monitoring, and other less physically demanding aspects of his regular position. The timing coincided with the completion of the initial training materials and the beginning of the testing phase for the Bear Encounter program. Scott's first day back in uniform was both familiar and strange. The weight of the utility belt, the snug fit of the ranger hat, the sense of purpose that came with wearing the official National Park Service emblem all felt like returning to his natural state after a prolonged absence. Yet there was also a new awareness, a heightened consciousness, a vulnerability that hadn't been present before. Not fear exactly, but a deeper respect for the wildness that remained at the core of even the most visited national park. The testing phase of the training program involved selected rangers from Yosemite and several other parks with significant bear populations. These participants worked through the curriculum Scott's team had developed, providing feedback on everything from the clarity of the materials to the effectiveness of the practical exercises. One component in particular, the field simulation of bear encounters using rangers in specially designed training suits, proved especially valuable in creating realistic response scenarios. The stress inoculation elements are making a real difference, Samantha observed after completing one particularly challenging simulation. I've had bear safety training before, but this is the first time I've felt like my body was actually learning the responses, not just my mind. Similar feedback from other test participants confirmed that the program was achieving its primary goal, preparing rangers to respond effectively to bear encounters, even under the influence of the physiological stress response that such incidents triggered. The development team refined the materials based on this feedback, preparing for a full rollout to seasonal staff training for the following year. 12 weeks after the attack, Scott was finally cleared for full duty, including solo backcountry patrols. His first assignment was deliberately symbolic, a morning patrol of the Lower Pines campground area, similar to the one he had been conducting on the day of the encounter. Linda Sullivan arranged to accompany him for the first hour, both as a precaution and as moral support for what they both recognized would be a psychologically significant moment. Nervous? Linda asked as they set out in the early morning light, following the same trail Scott had taken 3 months earlier. Not nervous, Scott replied after consideration. Respectful, more aware of how quickly circumstances can change out here. They walked in companionable silence for a while, checking campsites and food storage compliance, exchanging greetings with early rising visitors. When they approached the area where Scott had first spotted Bear 457's cubs, he paused, surveying the now familiar landscape with heightened attention. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "I came around that bend, heard the cubs over by that oak, and then the wind shifted." Linda stood beside him, allowing him the moment to process the return to the site of his trauma. "Do you want to walk through the area, or should we take the alternative trail?" she asked, leaving the decision entirely to him. Scott considered briefly before stepping forward along the original path. "No point avoiding it. This is part of my territory too." They completed the patrol without incident, finding the woods peaceful in the morning light. Bear activity in the area had decreased as summer progressed, and natural food sources shifted to higher elevations, though regular sightings were still reported throughout the park. Scott found that returning to the location of the attack brought a sense of closure rather than anxiety. The landscape itself was not threatening, merely the context of that particular moment in time when human and bear paths had crossed in, an unfortunate configuration. By the end of the summer, the Bear Encounter training program was finalized and approved for implementation. Scott's involvement had expanded beyond the original concept to include video demonstrations that would be used in ranger training throughout the national park system. His first-hand account of the attack, combined with practical instruction on proper response techniques, created a powerful educational tool that balanced respect for wildlife with effective safety protocols. The final component of the program was a field guide for rangers, incorporating both technical information about bear behavior and practical response guidelines. Scott insisted on including a section emphasizing the importance of public education and prevention rather than focusing solely on incident response. "The best bear encounter is the one that never happens," he wrote in the introduction. "Our primary responsibility is helping visitors understand how to respect wildlife boundaries and minimize the chances of negative interactions. When encounters do occur, our response should reflect both our commitment to human safety and our respect for the wild nature of the animals under our stewardship." As fall approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of color to Yosemite's deciduous trees, Scott received final medical clearance with no permanent restrictions on his activities. The scars on his leg had faded somewhat, but remained visible reminders of the encounter. Occasionally, changes in weather brought twinges of discomfort, and certain movements still triggered momentary pain in his side where the bear's teeth had punctured his flesh. But these were minor considerations compared to the prospect of fully resuming the work he loved. On a crisp September morning, Scott guided a small group of newly hired seasonal rangers along the same trail where his encounter with Bear 457 had occurred. The training session was the first practical implementation of the program he had helped develop, and the location had been chosen deliberately for its educational value. "This is where I made a critical error," Scott explained, indicating the EE position where he had found himself between mother and cubs. "I failed to properly account for how the changing wind direction would carry my scent. When conducting surveys in areas with known bear activity, always approach clearings from downwind when possible, and be hyper-aware of wind shifts when they occur." The new rangers listened attentively, clearly impacted by hearing these lessons from someone who had experienced the consequences of the situation he was describing. Scott continued the training, demonstrating proper use of bear spray, explaining behavioral cues that might precede an aggressive response, and emphasizing the importance of maintaining appropriate distance from all wildlife, particularly mothers, with young. As the group moved through the practice scenarios, Scott noticed movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, a dark shape moving through the underbrush about 100 yards distant. He calmly raised his binoculars, focusing on the area where he had detected motion. A black bear emerged briefly into a small clearing before continuing on its way, showing no particular interest in the human activity nearby. It was a mature, female, though not Bear 457. This individual lacked the distinctive white chest patch that identified the bear involved in Scott's encounter. Still, the timing of the appearance during this first training session seemed somehow appropriate, a reminder of why this work mattered. Scott pointed out the bear to the trainees, using the real-time observation to reinforce the lessons of the training program. The rangers watched with a combination of excitement and newfound respect as the bear foraged briefly before disappearing back into the forest, moving naturally through its habitat according to rhythms established long before humans had claimed portions of the landscape for their own purposes. Later that evening, as Scott sat on his cabin porch watching the sunset paint Half Dome in shades of gold and pink, he reflected on the journey of the past 4 months. The attack had changed him, certainly, physically in the form of scars and occasional pain, professionally in the expansion of his role beyond traditional field duties, personally in his deepened appreciation for the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in shared landscapes. Yet the core of his identity as a ranger remained intact, perhaps even strengthened by the experience. His commitment to protecting both the natural resources of Yosemite and the visitors who came to experience them had found new expression through the training program, potentially influencing park management practices beyond his individual actions on daily patrols. Bear 457 had long since moved to different territory with her cubs, following ancient patterns of seasonal movement dictated by food availability and instinctual knowledge. The last confirmed sighting had placed her near Tuolumne Meadows, nearly 20 miles from the location of the encounter, where a rich autumn berry crop provided sustenance for the coming winter. Park biologists predicted she would soon begin seeking a denning site at middle elevations, where her cubs would complete their first year of life before eventually establishing territories of their own. Scott's radio crackled with the evening check-in call from Ranger headquarters. He responded with the standard acknowledgement, confirming his position and status as he had done thousands of times over his 15-year career. The familiar ritual connected him to the network of colleagues spread throughout Yosemite's vast wilderness, all engaged in the sometimes challenging but always meaningful work of stewardship. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared above the granite peaks, Scott felt a profound sense of belonging, not just to the human community of the National Park Service, but to the broader web of life that included Bear 457 and all the other creatures that called Yosemite home. The encounter that had nearly claimed his life had paradoxically deepened his connection to the wilderness he had dedicated his career to protecting. Tomorrow would bring new patrols, new visitors seeking guidance, new challenges in balancing human access with resource protection. And Scott Davis, Ranger badge still proudly worn despite the scars beneath his uniform, would face them with the wisdom that comes only from direct experience of both the beauty and the danger inherent in truly wild places.